All right, just making sure that we are. I like how I'm like, I'm gonna make sure we're live places, and then I didn't open it anywhere.
Dragons.
I don't
do my dragon dance while you're sorting
Dragon
all
dance?
the tech out in the background. Yeah, because apparently that's a thing now. The dragon dance. Hi, everyone. Are you all ready for the good old Dragons of Grand Cathay? Because I'm very much looking forward to this one, largely because I haven't played Total War, the third one, yet. So obviously the dragons, to me, are nothing more than this ephemeral thing that exists, that I have some loose awareness of, that I've read occasional bits and pieces on. I know a good chunk about the individual dragons, but all of it's sort of second-hand knowledge rather than first-hand. So I'm particularly looking forward to this stream. I'm particularly looking forward to seeing what the good old Loremaster of Sotek is going to throw in our direction there, and what craziness he'll throw back at me with. And what do you think of this, Andy? So it's going to be really good.
All right. Yes. So, oh man, there's a lot to go over. So this one, and I do want to open with, we're just going to be having a good time of nice, fun lore stream here, focusing on the Dragon Kids. So it's going to take us to a lot of different other places. So we're going to go ahead and jump into it of dragons. So dragons, of course, have been a part of Warhammer Fantasy for ever. I think since the very beginning, is a safe thing to say. But the new lore that we got for the Cathayan dragons added a very different set of situations. So before, I think what's important to establish is that before, way back in the mists of time, in the beginning of the Warhammer world,
when I was playing,
yeah. Yes, yeah, Andy was out there playing before the old one showed up. But so back when the Warhammer world was a single supercontinent and most of the world was covered in ice, and you just had the equator being this super crazy jungle where all our favorite dinosaurs lived, most of the world was dominated by a lot of different species that aren't around anymore. But there were, of course, a couple of empires during this time that were very powerful in their own right. You had the good old Famir away in the cold mires. You had what may or may not have been the precursors, or just what are the Naga of Koresh somewhere else. But the dominant species were the dragons. They were the lords of the skies, and they really enjoyed fighting each other for dominance. And of course, they weren't fighting just each other. There were other terrible titans of those times. Some of the newer lore says that the Sky Titans were already around at this point.
Yep.
And the Dragon Ogres, of course, were around. And the Dragon Ogres were kind of one of the original main opponents of the dragons. But the dragons really and truly were kind of the kings of the world. And so what Cathay did is it kind of stepped into this space of myth where we had a few names. We had Draupnir, who is said to be the father of the dragons according to high elf mythologies. And he seemed to be considered kind of on par with a lot of the elven pantheon. And in, I believe, 8th edition, in 8th edition, he got some lore focusing on him. And it said that he was a ally or a friend of Ashurin in a sense. But eventually, one of the gods, Anathrema, the savage huntress, she viewed Draupnir not as an equal, but as a creature, something to be hunted and to be killed. And she tried to kill him, and that actually got her banished from Ashurin's side and cast out of the court of the gods. And she's been super salty about it ever since. And furthermore, there are other myths involving Draupnir saying that, like, the Widowmaker, the Sword of Cain, was actually forged using his breath. So Vol relied on Draupnir's flames in order to make the God Killer. But that's
Indeed,
just...
that becomes a part of Calador's history all the way through, because it apparently happened up over in Calador as well.
Yes, and so, but he's in a lot of ways considered the father of the dragons. However, there are competing myths that... according to other dragons or humans that or wizards that have recorded magical histories, there was another dragon named Kalgalanos the Black.
Good old Kalgalanos the Black.
Who totally was not ripped straight out of Tolkien mythos. But Kalgalanos was said to be as big as a mountain range, and he was terribly massive and huge, and seemed to be a main rival of Kraken Rock the Black, who is the father of the Dragon Ogre race. The two of them were likely very big rivals, and nobody knows what happened to Kalgalanos. He was around, and he was said to be so big that he makes modern dragons look like a joke. They they are mere spawnlings compared to him. But
it's also worth adding a small part that most of that dragon's kids were all of different colors, not black. And the concept of different colored dragons loosely came from, over in the West, that particular dragon's spawn, so to speak.
Yeah, and if it makes anyone feel better, Draugr is said not to have been black. He was likely a much brighter color. If he was not outright white, he was probably a very pretty blue of some kind. So they weren't all, not all of the old big reptiles were the same color. But so those were the ones we were familiar with before we get into the new Cathay lore, which the Cathay lore suggests that in the east of the supercontinent, there was a third super big, ancient, powerful dragon, and his name was Shen Yang. And Shen Yang, we actually have a surprising amount of information on him in that there was a really big mountain range. It wasn't by any means the largest, but there was a mystical mountain range where the winds of Azir were drawn like no other. Like Azir was almost pulled to it like its own. It scraped across the top of a mountain known as Kunlan, or it'll become known as Kunlan later. And it said that there was an egg that sat up there in ancient primordial times that bathed in the celestial wind. And when it hatched, out of it came Shen Yang. And Shen Yang apparently was so, he was so embroiled in Azir that he is almost an Azirian dragon, which the concept of dragons of specific winds was introduced back in the good old tabletop days. There's implied to be dragons that if they stay long, dragons are very magical creatures, and if they sit in a wind for long enough, or they're somewhere where winds of magic might interact with them, it can change them and it can give them certain properties.
I'd say some of the older ones, it's not so much that the dragons themselves changed, because there's not really any real hints, particularly with the older lore, where the dragon started off as one thing and became another thing through the course of its life. It's more that each of the dragons were a particular color, and that particular color often came hand in hand with aspects and traits that we now associate with the winds. For example, blue dragons, they came with lightning. Your black dragons came with big poisonous winds. Well, as did your green dragons, but a slightly different poisonous wind. Corrosive cloud, very Dar, or poisonous wind, very Jade, maybe, arguably rotting, you could argue. And each of the dragons, the red dragons, always spouting fire. They were very closely associated with the winds, but after they were initially written, not before. So they weren't written to match the winds, they were written, and then later on they were matched to winds, and lore was added that said something along the lines of dragons need magic to keep going, particularly those elven ones, which is why the most of them are asleep, which also to a degree has been overwritten in some places, where instead they said many of the dragons just didn't like the heat as the world was moved by the old ones closer to the sun, closer to Sol, and that heat caused many of them to hibernate. So there's lots of different competing stories here as to exactly what dragons, at least on the western side, are. We've got some pretty strong, clear visions, though, of what they are over on the Cathayan side.
Yes, which, just like Andy said, the world changed. So dragons were dominant, and then all of a sudden, these aliens showed up. Quite literally, they showed it. Their silvered starships came flying across the skies, and they said, "That place looks like a nice summer home. Let's set up shop here and change everything." So the old one showed up, and there's actually a lot of really, really cool, subtle references about the relationship between the old ones and the dragons, because the old ones were genocidal maniacs in a lot of ways, but they liked the dragons. When they actually met the dragons, there was dialogue between them, which is very, very significant when you're looking at the lore, because one of the things that's very interesting about the old ones is virtually nobody knows what the old ones look like, and nobody that is still around and is willing to talk about it seems to have had any personal experience with the old ones. And in the Lizardmen have always held to the idea, the Slans say, that only like the mightiest of creatures could handle talking with an old one, because otherwise it would just melt your brain. Trying to talk with them apparently was a very stressful experience, because only the first generation Slan were allowed to. Lord Croak and his 4 Spawn brothers were the only ones that were able to handle talking with the old ones. But so were the original dragons.
And I think this is actually a fascinating aspect of the new development for the background. Not just that our pre-Old One times have had some extra details scattered across it, but it's that we now have creatures that have potentially directly interacted with the mysterious Old Ones that shall never be detailed. And you might find that when the studio takes this back with Games Workshop and they start writing their own version of Grand Cathay for their army list, which inevitably are going to come when they do the old world, you might find that they scale some of this back because there's this disconnect with the old ones that they like to maintain. And the idea that there's figures out there that not only remember them, which is not so bad, but can actually recall speaking to them and what they could look like, in some respects takes away the mystery of them. So it wouldn't surprise me if later lore revisions go, yep, there was indeed Eastern dragons and perhaps other dragons back in that time, but they did not like the old ones. They separated from them. They hated everything that they represented and never talked with them. So it really wouldn't surprise me if that becomes the standard lore. Although as it currently stands, it's far more uncertain exactly what the relationships were back then.
Yeah, and one of the things that's super interesting with that is they have been smart so far in not saying at all whether Shen Yang or any of the dragons actually had direct contact with the old ones. There are some implications that Shen Yang definitely saw them. It seems that even the Dragon Children may have seen them, which we'll get into the actual kiddos in a minute. But Shen Yang, he certainly witnessed a lot of their works. And what we do know about Shen Yang during this time is that, like all the dragons, he resented their influence because Shen Yang was very powerful. He had his own little empire carved out, and sure, he was fighting against other giants, other primordial titans, but that was their world. All of a sudden, things started changing. The planet moved closer to the sun. Magic started being far more interacted with and being concentrated through all these specifically designed systems to flow it in particular patterns. And all of a sudden, like, the very star system started changing, and all, the local planets were changing. Everything started getting weird. And then the continents got broken up and moved into different places, all according to the designs of these very strange creatures that, if you go back and watch the original Cathay trailer, as Miao Ying says, they attempted to control fate. They wanted to shape the very destiny of the cosmos, and they were messing with forces they did not understand, is how the dragons feel about it.
And I think that's a really, really interesting thing. If you're trying to imagine what these effectively immortal dragons are like, consider these ancient primordial creatures living on the Warhammer world before it becomes the one that we know and love today. And consider what it would be like for them to feel not just the impact of slight and small changes, but cosmic level, world-changing shifts happening. And possibly all they're aware of is the streaks of silver that came through the sky. Upon silver ships they came. And loosely, that's the only details that you find about the old ones, beyond occasional details here and there amongst the lizardman side. But they're so poorly described. They get these streaks of light through the sky, and then suddenly the world itself is shifting, and so many of them are incapable of surviving in the new climate that it becomes. And indeed, almost all of the dragons go sleepy times.
Yes, and what's very well noted about Shen Yang in particular is that even among the ancient primordial dragons, he seemed very, very magically competent. Because it's said that one of the things that I got to, because I've had a few conversations with Andy Hall in a similar interview format like this, which has been a privilege to kind of talk about the new lore, because that son of a gun has like an 8th edition army book for Grand Cathay that he helped Games Workshop, and he has it and he won't let me see it. It makes me mad, but hoarding his treasure over there. But despite all of my attempted bribes, but Shen Yang uses magic to resist going to sleep. So where the others all vanish, because like we don't know at all what happened to Draugr or Kalgalanos. It's some hypothesize that they died, but most who kind of understand the way the world works really doubt it. because killing dragons like that is hard.
Yeah, we're talking ancestor gods of the dwarves required to take these buggers out. They're proper impressive, and most likely to either be asleep or killed by god level entities.
Yeah, so most of them vanish. And just a reminder that the Warhammer world is significantly bigger than our world. So there are a lot of places for them to hide. It's said that many of them retreat beneath the oceans, or they go into the deepest of the depths beneath the mountains. But they all seemingly vanish from the world. And like Andy said earlier, it's not 100% clear why. Some suggest that it's because the way the old ones were messing with everything, like the amount of magic that was in the air just it was very strange to them, and they became very sluggish and torpid, and they just didn't want to. They were tired, and they just were like, you know what? We can just sleep for a few thousand years and wait for all this to blow over. But we'll go take a nap, and when we wake up, all these aliens and their spawn things will be dead, and we'll go back to taking over the world like we used to.
Yeah, it's a super fascinating period, because there's been lots of different authors who've written this section in lots of different ways, and most of them have taken a mythical approach, in that they will describe some sort of mythical event that is spoken from the perspective of somebody actually inside the Warhammer world, and by doing that, it allows you to almost say anything, while simultaneously confirming nothing. And that tends to be the case for most of this period. Take, for example, the famous "In Silver Ships They Came" line. That comes from Fenrir in the Book of Days. And whilst it might be almost 6,000 years old as a quotation, it's still nevertheless young in comparison to many of the dragons. And they just don't cross over. They're such a different set. Indeed, there might be ancient dragons that have just never woken up. And I think to reconfirm what Sotek's saying there, the exact reason why dragons aren't active is uncertain, but younger dragons, particularly of the Western kind, are often, particularly when you're moving through the fourth and fifth area, particularly with some of the older white dwarves as well, often directly associated with magic, in that the more magic there is in the world, the more likely they are to wake up. There's historical reasons for this. It's because it's often, as is often the case with Games Workshop, based upon other fantasy sources. In this case, the dragons of Michael Moorcock were all asleep because chaos, in their case, had left the world. And then as chaos came flooding back into the world again because of the actions of the novels, the dragons began to wake up again. And that's somewhat similar to how the High Elves and the Dark Elves have had their dragons, because they're so strongly sourced upon the old Melnibonian concepts. And because of that, you'll find that often there's lots of little lines and theories and snippets put in saying that when the great chaos gates wax and magic floods across the world, it's far more likely that the dragons themselves will begin to stir. And say, for example, the Dragon Princes of Calador, instead of marching out on their horses because all their dragons are napping, all the dragons will come out, and come the end times, they'll be swooping through the sky on dragon backs once again. And that's super awesome, and it makes for an epic end times every time that you get yourself one of the cycles of the Everchosen. And it makes for some great stories, which is one of the reasons that it's never really disappeared from the setting, even though the core foundations of where it came from have slowly but surely been erased away over time, as each of the species have been written slightly differently. Oh, I've just got a burr. Oh, that's your fault.
Amber alert. those come through occasionally. Anyway, but yes, and to further add to that, that's also something that's explored with like storms of magic. Is that storms of magic can be so dangerous because they can wake up some of these ancient dragons, which happens occasionally, because they're asleep, but they're not dead, and they're not necessarily in comas, and they can be disturbed. They can be woken up, which can be apocalyptic level events for certain civilizations, and has been. But like Andy was saying earlier, it takes something insane to kill one of these things. One of the really, really famous ancient dragons who does wake up is known as Skaladrak Incarnadin, who has a number. Actually, I think Skaladrak Incarnadin might be the descendant, and then Skaladrak was the OG one. I think because Incarnadin,
right. I can't recall off the top of my head. It's in the dwarfy side.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure Skaladrak Incarnate is the one that has like a rivalry with Karak Kadron. But Skaladrak, Skaladrak was the father, mother of Skaladrak Incarnate, and was so terrifying that it got woken up by the dwarfs. And the ancestor gods were around, and there was an epic battle between Skaladrak and Grimnir that was apparently so intense and so insane that Grimnir wins, and he does kill Skaladrak, but Skaladrak's breath was so hot and its death was so titanic that it created Blackfire Pass.
Yep.
Like the mountains themselves were burned out, and there's like an obsidian pass now because of that.
There's a big, massive, huge mountain on the side where many say that that's part of his old body, and it now just looks like a mountain, one of the highest mountains in the world's edge, and that's also super cool down the Black Mountains, pardon me, which I super like. It's also worth reiterating what Sotek says there about the storm of magic. There's a nice little supplement that basically says, magic comes, it goes mad. Here's all the big fucking creatures that come along as well. And dragons are tied directly into that. But again, we're discussing here loosely the Western ones, because as we move over to the East, they've got quite a different setup. But it's also worth saying that's only because we've got a very tight version of them from the Grand Cathay aspect. It's quite possible there's quite a lot more of them hiding away or snuck about in their own individual places that might surface in a variety of different ways when they eventually, assuming they do, detail Kuresh, detail Nippon, all of which will have their own legends, all of which will probably have their own version of the giant flying reptile.
Yeah. So now we're gonna head into what I like to call Age of Myth mode, which means we're heading into those foggy times where the timeline is not going to make sense, and we're going to do our best because I don't have, like we said, a copy of this magical Cathay army book that GW apparently made. So the timeline's about to get really weird because the dates that we have do not translate very nicely.
They really don't.
The new lore.
I was getting a bit bummed out because I've obviously been doing quite a lot of boning up for today, and I was looking through. I was going, "What's with this date? And what's with this date?" So I may be critical of a date or two.
Yeah. So there are. I do have a handy list of dates. Some of them, and it's worth noting that there were many attempts made to try and make the old Cathay lore match the new Cathay lore, which is good. Some of them make the leap. Some of them, they got there. They just didn't quite stick the landing.
Yeah.
So, in these ancient primordial times, Shen Yang is watching everything the old ones are up to. And he decides that he is going to try and maintain control over what he views as his piece of the world. And apparently the old ones are relatively fine with this. And it does make sense. I mean, it seemingly invited the dragons to Ulthuan. They didn't mind the dragons being there. And it seems very likely that some dragons were okayed by them, and the ones that didn't went to sleep.
So I'm going to add in a bit of potential argument, not against that, but a slightly different angle. One of the things we know for certain about the old ones is that they were, for want of a better description, sorcerer scientists. That's a nice way to combine the sort of things they were doing. And they were deep into creating species and manipulating them into something new. There is a strong possibility that one of the reasons they were happy with the dragons being over in, say, for example, Ulthuan, is because they did something to those ones, that they actually changed them. Where, for example, the dragons that are over in Grand Cathay, which may not have been changed, could show something quite different. So whenever you're dealing with these primordial stories, always remember that there's almost certainly going to be, regardless of what people later on say, a certain amount of old one fuckery.
Yeah. So Shen Yang is we don't know a lot of what he's up to in this time. It's said that he kind of is watching the very, very, very beginnings of humanity starting to show up. And he observes them from a distance. He does not care for humanity terribly much. He seems Shen Yang, even in the modern era, many thousands of years later, and having built an empire among humans, he sees them as a useful tool, but not. He does not care about humanity at all.
They're ants.
Yeah, they are.
They're pets. They're handiworker ants.
They are insignificant little specks that are useful to him, but they die too quickly for him to care. And even if he didn't, Shen Yang, he is often portrayed as very cold. He is not friendly to anybody, really. Like even his relationship with his children, although it is significantly better than, say, the Emperor of Mankind to his children, it's still not necessarily the most positive.
Screw that guy.
I just felt like throwing some shade there.
I mean,
but,
you have to.
But there is another individual that enters this circumstance. And so this is where timeline stuff gets very, very weird, because everything I'm about to go through is said to happen before the coming of chaos.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, it doesn't really make sense to happen before chaos shows up. But we're gonna take it as it's been written and see what happens. So one of the things that the old ones apparently might do is that turns out there is a civilization on the moon, Manslid, which is known as Yin in the Cathayan language. And this moon apparently has some sort of civilization race on it, but during the time of the old ones, they get wiped out. We have no idea why. Either the old ones decided that they needed to be destroyed because they did not fit within the great plan, or who knows what happened. Like I said, timeline stuff is here a little fuzzy because it would have made a lot of sense for the arrival of chaos to have resulted in the moon getting blasted and everybody dying.
And Morsley getting spun out into the... it would have made an awful lot of sense, indeed. And it's also worth saying that this particular section is also very much, as Sotek said, just to make sure we have this clear, mythical. In that there possibly was, there are these things. This suggests that this is the case. A lot of that language is just being deployed everywhere.
Oh, yeah. So from the moon, apparently, there is a singular survivor, which is an entity known as Quay. And what's important to say is that Quay is not a dragon.
No.
There's actually a lot of very explicit lines that state she is not a dragon at all. She is a shapeshifter. Yeah. We do not know what her original form is, but a dragon is not it. But when she comes down to the planet, she takes the form of a dragon, likely because she encounters Shen Yang very quickly.
Yep.
And she mirrors his form. And the two of them begin a relationship. Now, how lovey-dovey they are is up to interpretation. There are no notes about their relationship, other than Quay is said to be incredibly empathetic. She is far more emotional and giving and caring. It's a very notable aspect of her character. She's said to be extremely emotive, and she cares a lot about pretty much all forms of life that she encounters that she considers wholesome. So like she loves humans a lot. She cares a lot about all these little people. Shen Yang, not so much, but he does seem to care for his wife at least a bit.
I'll also say that there's a nice little detail to add here as well, where you've got the Emperor and your Empress sitting on the two sides. She's often sitting on the dark side of the yin-yang split. In fact, that's where she sits, which is not where, particularly from most Western mythologies, you sit, where you're like, the dark side must be bad, right? The light side is sitting in light and illumination and good. No, they're two halves of one bigger whole, and they require both to work in harmony. So I think that to a degree, you just by the fact that they sit on two halves, that tells you a lot about their relationship, that without each other they don't work. With each other, harmony is important. That becomes central to everything that Cathay becomes later, where harmony is at the core of everything.
Yes, and at this point they do begin to significantly affect one another and balance one another, and they become inseparable. All the lore we have about Shen Yang and Quay, they actually go everywhere together a lot of the time. A story we'll get into later is they even vanish at the same time.
Yep.
But the two of them begin. They become lovers and wed, or whatever Shen Yang is like. This is our. I'm really curious which of them proposed that marriage is the custom that they should go with. I'm curious. She brought it.
I'd say it's perhaps less a marriage, though it becomes a marriage in terms of what it is in time, but it's nothing more than them swearing to be with each other until the very end of all things.
Yeah, I wonder, it's like a part of me wonders if dragons have monogamous relationships, or if Quay Yin like brought that from the moon with her to the dragon. Which would be kind of a funny story.
Fascinating thing in general, particularly because as we reach this point, I imagine quite a lot of you are beginning to make your first realizations that none of the Cathayan dragons are, strictly speaking, pure dragon. Only one of them, the Emperor himself. The rest of them are half shapeshifter, which will come very much to pass as good old Mum shows them a thing or two later.
Yes. So speaking of that, Quay Yin, Shen Yang thinks he knows a lot, and he does. Shen Yang is said to be able, he is a master of magic. He's able to wield all 8 of the winds of magic. He's able to wield high magic, but from high magic, Shen Yang, he is a celestial focused being. Azir is almost in his blood.
Yep.
And so he takes high magic and he, instead of splitting it into only Azir, he seems to focus specifically on forming what we understand as a new lore of magic, which is called the lore of Yang, after him. That's where it gets its name from. The lore of Yang is from Shen Yang, and the lore of Yin is from Quay Yin. And Shen Yang takes the lore of Azir as the main focus and seems to select 3 complementary lores that shape it into something very bold and aggressive and assertive and fiery and proud. And that is the lore of Yang. It brings out these very like raw parts of your soul. It brings out these very like loud, bright, shining elements of anyone who's cast on. It's a very explosive lore of magic. It
in
wields
your face.
Yeah, it wields the fire of dragons and stars falling to the earth in the form of dragon constellations. It's a very bombastic lore of magic. While on the flip side, Quay Yin, coming from the dark side of the moon, so to speak, she brings with her a far more subtle wind. She, it seems, mostly derived from Ulgu as its main focus, with 3 complementary lores being the other half of that balance, the other half of that equation. And Quay Yin's mastery of Yin being Shadow Beasts, Shadow Beast, Metal, and Death. Her lore is far more about spiritualness, illusions, emotions, perception. It leans very heavy, in particular, between Ulgu and Shaish, but you can definitely see the influences of Beast and Metal within it. Of how it furthers these manipulations and how it entangles itself with people's spirits, especially. And the 2 of them introduce their lores to one another. They teach each other one another's lores. And the most important thing that happens in this moment is that Quay Yin teaches Shen Yang how to transform himself. But because he is not a true shapeshifter, his shapeshifting is very limited, and Shen Yang can only turn himself into the form of a human. Is what she eventually manages to teach him, is that he can turn himself into the form of a man. And his disguise is, it's not a great disguise. Shen Yang's human form is said to be very obviously not human. He has like, if you've ever read those descriptions of like, when a celestial being in our world's mythology, or like 40K's mythology with the Emperor, like when someone like that takes a human form, they're radiant. You're like, oh, clearly that's a god. That's no man. That's how Shen Yang appeared. Whereas the Moon Empress is flawless. Yep. She blends in so well that I doubt anyone, even like the most perceptive of wizards, would probably be able to tell. Because for her, it's not necessarily a spell ability; it is a genuine ability.
Yep.
Which is crazy to think about. So you have these 2.
Not a dragon.
Yes. Yeah.
So for her, being a dragon is just as convincing as being a human.
Yes, so the 2 of them begin wandering what we know as Cathay in human form. They begin speaking with humans, getting to know the humans, and Quay Yin really leads the charge on this. She is telling Shen Yang that they should try to understand humanity, that there is something valuable here. Now, Shen Yang interprets some of that, internalizes some of that, but he seems to internalize more of there's something useful here. and that humans can be a useful tool. He can build a nation here. He can bring these humans together. Now, this is where like we said with like the moon thing makes a lot more sense after Chaos. This part also makes a lot more sense after Chaos, which is
this
about
whole section, timing wise, just makes me shake my head.
Yeah, so it's worth
as
noting,
it currently stands.
It's worth noting that the unification of Cathay is not supposed to really happen until like
minus 1800. Pardon me. It's like thousands of years away.
Yeah. So there's a big gap there because Chaos shows up in like minus 5800, something like that.
It's a good anything from, because they do tend to mess around with the dates at various points, but the simplest one is probably at the earliest 10,000 years ago. And Chaos, they're definitely at war, and it's coming to some sort of conclusion around about 500 years ago. So a good 2,500 years worth of war approximately, plus some on either side, depending on which book you go for. Initially, way back in the day, it was generally always approximately 10,000 years before the time of Sigmar, but that sort of there we go.
But appreciate you showing up on the stream, Shen. Thank you.
It was super handy, thanks. But that sort of fumbled together to being just 10,000 years ago, so around about 7,500 years back when it all went tits up. But approximately both those dates do. It's a long time ago. That's all that really matters.
Yes.
But it's 1,800 years, well, minus 1,800 years that the Great Bastion goes up, and it's all bound together. We have a long period of time here. A really good one.
So what the new lore apparently tells us is that in this gap, between the old ones arriving and them messing with the planet, which takes them a good while,
it could be forever.
Yeah, and Quay comes down. The two of them begin having children.
Kids.
And once again, lore here gets immediately fuzzy because they're hilariously, despite the fact Cathay lore is like less than 3 years old at this point, it already has some contradictions, which is hilarious. According to the most recent lore we have, being the new short story by David Geimer, the first child born is Shiyama. And one of the things that's very, very interesting about the Dragon Children, and I suspect implies that their conception is not as how do I say this? It's not as natural as it may appear, is that each of the Dragon Children corresponds to a wind of magic.
Yeah.
Except for there are 9 of them. So there is a bonus child who we have no idea what the situation there is. We don't know if they were a combination of the 8 winds as a child, or if they were the rejection of the 8 winds as a child. Who knows?
Or it's something completely different, or just another wind that we're not aware of.
Yeah, Lore of Ice Dragon. There you go.
Here's a nice dragon. Here's a something different dragon. Who can particularly say? I'll carry on.
Yeah, so we have Shiyama. Shiyama is the spirit dragon or the death dragon, which Cathay understands the 8 winds of magic the way it is taught to them by Xing and Quay. They understand magic differently because the dragons do not describe it like the elves do. The dragons describe it as, instead of the lore of life, it is the elemental wind of water, also known as the storm wind. It's their version of the lore of life is actually a lot more scary in appearance. It's a lot more cloudy and thunderous, which we'll get into in a little bit. Their lore of fire, elemental wind of fire. That one's easy. The lore of metal is known as the elemental wind of iron, specifically, likely because that's the first metal that they understood very well. The wind of death the lore of death is known as the elemental wind of spirit to the Cathayans. The lore of beasts, very interestingly, is known as the elemental wind of wood to the Cathayans.
That one blows my mind of all of them.
Yeah, and then we have the wind of heavens, which is my favorite because it actually makes a lot of sense and solves a lot of really fun conundrums. Is known as the elemental wind of stone to the dragons. And then you have light, which is the elemental wind of light. Easy. And then who am I missing? Shadow, which is known as the elemental wind of Shadow. So thankfully there are three or four direct translations and then 4 that get a little interesting. So the firstborn, as I said, is Shiyama, the spirit dragon. And Shiyama, we actually have a description of her, which is just that she appears blind, or she has kind of eyes that look dead and likely see things. She likely sees a very different perception of reality than anything else does, being so intertwined with the Shyish, which has some crazy properties, which if you haven't, go watch our Winds of Magic stream episode that we did, because there's a lot of cool stuff there. But what's interesting about Shiyama is her visage is described that she has hair that is multicolored, which is very bizarre.
It's interesting as well, because it does suggest that perhaps they could move off just the core basics of the winds for them, and that may become a later development, because it does in some respects restrict these creatures which are majestic and extraordinary, and in many respects the equivalent of Cathayan gods, but they are in some respects restricted to a wind while simultaneously not being so when you actually use them. It's a bit... There's some leeway that's being built into it there.
Yes, and each of the Dragon Children, should be noted, they do not purely wield one wind of magic. They wield high magic functionally, and now they levitate towards the wind that they themselves are embodying, because they have a natural affinity for it, and it seems to shape a lot of who they are as an individual. Which makes sense. And what's very interesting about Shiyama is Shiyama apparently was born very, very early, very early after Quay and Shen Yang meet one another, but she also dies very early. Shiyama is said to pass away before the birth of I have no idea if they were eggs or if they were live birth. Who knows? But
well, I can guarantee something. We did a stream with Andy Hall on the Rookery, and the question came up: how are they birthed? And the answer was, I don't know.
We do know that Shen Yang came from an egg, because there's a whole thing about his egg, the egg he was birthed from. You like little pieces of it infuse the Kunlun mountain range with the magic of Azir. But if they were born as dragons, it was probably eggs, which is very likely. Dragons are their true forms, so I think eggs is a safe enough bet. But in any event, Shiyama, we have no idea how she dies, which is a really fun mystery. If you actually look at the map for Grand Cathay in Total War Warhammer, there is a very specific place down in the southeast of Grand Cathay known as Shiyama's Rest.
Yep.
Which seems to heavily imply that is where she died. Yeah, and it's technically connected to the central Cathay and the Celestial Riverlands, but it's very, very close to where central, south, and east Cathay meet, right next to one of the rivers.
And particularly given that she's said to be sleeping under the river down there anyway, and it's quite a bit further south from there, but still, it's all in the same area.
Yeah. So one of the fun mysteries that I actually want to speculate for a moment on is what happened. Why did Shiyama die? And I think there's 2 really interesting theories. The first is that Shiyama was destined to die, or may have, her death may have been purposeful by her parents or herself, and not a incident per se, or she was killed in a battle during that age. Because even when the old ones were around, the world was not safe. There were a lot of big bads running around. Dragon ogres were still a notable force to be reckoned with. The Famir were still around, and were fighting, because the lizardmen dominated a lot of the planet, but they were not able to dominate everything. The old ones were sending out literally legions of millions of Saurus that were there's literally a war of extermination that takes place across the world, where the old ones start looking at races and going, not part of the plan, not part of the plan, not part of the plan. And the Saurus are sent out to butcher them. But they can't kill everything, because the greenskins are introduced during this time. On accident, literally being an invasive species, which is hilarious. Because one of the old ones didn't go through customs properly. He tried to skip customs. The son of a bitch. so Shiyama could very well have been killed. She could have been killed by greenskins. She could have been killed by a dragon ogre Shaggoth. I personally think it would be amazing if it turned out she was killed by like Kolek Suneater or Kraken Rock the Black or one of these like big bads that we have a fun name for.
I think it's also worth saying that we've got the potential that with the coming of chaos, something happened there as well. Because the world itself changes and the things that keep things alive change. The winds of magic change. Magic itself, depending upon how it existed before, completely changes. Everything in the world changes. And you could easily tie it up to not necessarily the event itself, but potentially even the build up towards that event. There's lots of fun potential stories that could be told here as to exactly how she passes on. It could have just been a natural development of her own self. She herself being so closely associated with death, as we come to know later, and she effectively becomes the Maw of the realm. For those of you who know your Empire lore, Maw, the god of death, and ferries souls over towards the 10, whatever it is, celestial courts, whatever it is that lies beyond. So she's still doing stuff, much like a god. So it could have been a natural process. It could have been something that she chose to do herself, even if it was a sacrifice, for example.
Yeah. Gideon, we're getting there. Don't worry. Thank you. Thank you very much for the super chat. But don't worry, we're getting there. I will say also, CB, hi, I'm a shapeshifter from the moon. Let's make babies, the changeling. Something Loki turning into a female horse, something. But I will say I have a personal theory that I like, though it's heretical and it's very difficult to make work in this timeline.
Do love heretical theories.
I honestly think, to me, I think the ogres killed Shiyama.
Ogres?
Because one thing we'll get to later is Shen Yang hates the ogres. He almost wipes them out. And there are some explanations for why he does this, but I've always found the modern explanations to be very weak of like, oh, they started eating the peasants. He doesn't give a shit about peasants. Shen Yang doesn't care. But if they killed his daughter, I think that would be a grudge that would last for a long time. And the ogres being wiped out actually happens a pretty freaking long time ago. It actually happens before the founding of the Great Bastion.
Which, in many respects, again, sort of...
yeah.
feels like it should be older.
Yeah. But, because who knows? Maybe because the old ones were still around at this point, the old one that created the ogres was like, Shen Yang's like, I'm going to kill those ogres. And he's like, it's one of ours. You can't kill those. They belong to us. And he had to bide his time. But in any event, Shiyama passes away, and we don't know if her body is taken per se, but her essence, what is left of her as the spirit dragon, remains somehow tethered to the mortal realm. And she is taken to the north, next to where Quay and Shen Yang have founded what is known as Weijin, the Celestial City, which is literally a floating city up in the skies, where Shen Yang and his wife spend a lot of their time away from humanity, literally in a floating city that you can't get to unless they want you to be there. And they are already working on some projects, which we'll get into in a little bit. But Shiyama is taken north, and she is laid to rest beneath the Spirit River, or the Dragon River. And the Dragon River flows from Weijin all the way out to the Jade Sea. And she is laid to rest beneath it, supposedly. Now, once again, was her body put down there? Just her spirit? Who knows? But what we do know is that she's definitely down there in some form. And in her death, her enmeshment, I don't know if that's a word, but you know what I mean, with the lore of the Wind of Death becomes absurdly more powerful, which makes sense because death would kind of naturally be repelled by a living individual. And she becomes so radiant with death magic that the river itself becomes a river of death. if you try to cross it and you do not have the blessing of the dragons, you will just die. You will instantly die. There are invaders from the Chaos Wastes and the Eastern Steppes that try to invade Cathay every year across the Dragon River, and they always die. They die, and it's said to, when you see them, it looks like they almost died peacefully because there's no sign of battle. There's no sign of damage. There's just a bunch of corpses. It's like they all fell asleep. Now, it seems vaguely implied by some various quotes and some notes that have been made about the Dragon River that what might happen is when you start crossing the river, spirits and like hands start literally coming up out of the water and grab your soul and rip it out of your body and drag it down into the river, which is terrifying. But,
dragging it down.
Yeah. Oh my God. Stream's over. I'm leaving.
I'm sorry.
So that she's down there, and we will come back to Shiyama in a little bit when we talk more about when we get a little more away from the timeline stuff. But she goes on to functionally create an underworld, and it is the Cathayan afterlife, which is insane because it's not. It's very strange that she is said to she is dreaming down there. It said that Shiyama is in a death sleep. She is dead, but she is also slumbering. And her dreams are said to be the Cathayan afterlife, where the spirits of the ancestors, being the humans that die, are guided to after they die, and they continue to exist so that their wisdom and their power may be leaned upon when needed for Cathay in the future, which is wild.
It's totally wild, particularly because it does suggest that her death was not a death as we understand it. As simple as that. Because we know certain things are true. They're not gods. They're definitely not gods. In fact, if anything, they're quite anti-god in general. So the courts of Shyish that are dreamed into existence down there are quite discrete and separate to the other afterlives as we understand them. And that's fascinating. It's super interesting.
Yes. And it's very it's Malignard, thank you. I guess.
Nice.
We appreciate it. Thank you. So one of the things that's very interesting is, I'm going to keep saying this multiple times throughout this conversation, of that this gets weird with the timeline stuff, because why would Shen Yang want to make the Dragon River impenetrable to cross if chaos was not a threat?
Yeah.
Now you could argue that maybe the Hobgoblin Khanate already existed or was starting to emerge, but this is very, very early for that.
It's too early for that. If we're talking before the coming of chaos, it's pretty much too early, really.
Yeah. Honestly, I am growing more and more of the opinion that the Dragon Kids probably should have been born after the coming of chaos. Yeah. But
it does make a lot more sense if they have been, or alternatively, they were born during the coming of chaos, and the war is going on. It's in progress, and that immediately makes more sense for a whole host of things that happen during this era.
Yeah. Now, yes, like Quora said, that is very true. It could be that Shen Yang saw what was coming. That is very distinctly possible. He is very tied up with Azir, and there's...
I will add, though, that there was possibly no Azir at that time. Because Azir, as we understand it, came about because of the collapse of the Chaos, well, what became the Chaos Gates. The Winds of Magic, as we understand them, are very much a product of the immaterial world flooding into the material one. But at that point, before the coming of chaos, who knows what it was like? It's very possible that they weren't using magic at all as we understand it. And comparing and trying to use current lore to make sense of the previous era doesn't really work. The more you think about on it, the more you look at the mechanics of it, the more you realize that just doesn't fly, sadly.
Yeah. I honestly think if we ever get enough, which we will for the old world, but I think when they actually like sit down and try and work everything out, I think they'll come to a similar realization and be like, let's just fudge them a little bit after, because it still makes them older than like all the gods except for the chaos gods when it comes to the kids, which they are always happy to brag about. But in any event, so that's and Shiyama is kind of was worth doing on her own for a moment because her brother Yuan Bo talks about that none of the other kids knew Shiyama. She died, as far as they understand, she died before any of the rest of them were born. So then the rest of them are born. We do not know their birth order. We have some hints. We know Miao Ying calls herself
Probably
the eldest daughter.
Yeah.
It is very likely she is the second born. And I guess she calls herself the eldest daughter, and what she technically means is eldest living daughter.
And possibly just eldest, because, she's the eldest and a daughter. So be aware that could be the case, that she is both eldest and daughter, and she just conflates the two.
Yeah. And then I would suggest that Yuan Bo is probably after that, because he has a lot of authority and a lot of power, especially among his siblings. The only one of his siblings that is often considered most favored beyond him is Miao Ying. And Yuan Bo he's very balanced, and
he's a safe hand.
Yes. After that likely comes, who knows? After that, it's a total toss up. The youngest we know are Zhao Ming and Shen Zhu. So Yuan Bo, or Miao Ying is who we'll probably talk about next. Miao Ying is the dragon of water, or more accurately, the storm dragon. She is cold and aloof, as we have heard. I don't think you were around for it, but the marketing for her got a lot of memes made about it, because every single time they published an article about Miao Ying, it said she's cold and aloof. Every single time. They included that note, and everyone's like, we get it. But
bring up that point from Gideon, because it's a good one. So to answer this one specifically, you've got to realize that almost everything is written from the perspective of the current thinking. So everything would suggest that it's whatever Azir was beforehand, and it may have been Azir. It may have been Azir plus. It may have been Azir plus plus. It may have been a completely different force that resembles Azir so much that's more than enough to describe it. The proto world, the one that existed before the old ones came along, the only thing that we can say for certain about that is that it was freezing. As we understand these things, it was probably a Pangea-like continent, and that it probably had a lot of species on it that we are aware of today, although many of them may have come because the old ones created them and we just think they're that old. The Fimmer, for example, sitting there, because they often are described as sitting before, but in some places, but in others, they were created, in others, they were humans, in others, they were actually Skaven. So there's lots of different tales that tie into each of them. So I would loosely cover that one with it's complicated, and Games Workshop themselves don't know, and each writer has attempted to do something, and as each new writer comes in, they'll probably change it.
Yeah. So breaking down the Dragon Children in no particular order, just to kind of cover their bases as far as what we know about them, and how they have wider impacts on the world. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to finish the timeline stuff very, very briefly, because everything else timeline related actually gets a lot more solid, which makes it a lot faster. So the Dragon Children are all born. Some point during this mess, Chaos shows up, and Chaos literally punches in the door and declares war on everybody. And it's a mess. Demons are pouring over the continents from everywhere at once. And while the demons are not endless in the sense that it's a never-ending tide, they are endless in that when they get beaten back, they will always return. And they're evolving.
So I think there's a few things to loosely add here. Number one is magic floods the world, which is why the demons keep coming. And this was a change from the original lore. In the original lore, humanity arrived. And a variety of mentions to that. Machines arrived. A whole host of things arrived as the Chaos Gods came. However, that got completely changed after about 6th edition, around about there in Warhammer times, when there was a lot of thought, and they were like, no, wait a minute, humans can't be around at that point. They didn't exist. And they turned it to demons. So the very first ever chosen, for example, who was originally Morcar, who was originally a human, and was originally defeated by an Aryan, whichever, no longer exists and is moved to a different point in the timeline. And this entire period has gone through multiple rewrites. So you must realize that as things are iterated here and we describe various events, not only are they events that have been rewritten multiple times, they're almost certainly going to be rewritten
again. Yeah.
Indeed. So be aware of that as Sotek goes through everything. But
yes,
the really, really big one here is humanity, because humanity probably does exist by this point, because it's multiply stated that either A, the old ones elevated them during the war to help them with the war, and that's stated in a few sources, or alternatively, humanity just existed on the world already, and that spans all the way back to original novels. Drachenfels, for example, mentions that humanity in a proto form was there at that point.
I always like to call Drachenfels Warhammer Vandal Savage.
Perfect. And then you also have other sources that hint that when the Chaos Gates yawned open, humans came along with that too. So be aware, there's all sorts of conflicting tales here. Some of them are ancient, some of them are new. But if you take a look at what the old world is doing, they're looking at a lot of the older material and they're updating it and telling those stories again. At the very beginning announcement for it, they mentioned half-orcs, for goodness sake. How does that work?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense at all, but they mentioned it, which means that they are looking back at the older material and they're going to be synthesizing some of it in. So we might find ourselves with a completely different retelling. So take everything we're saying here with a certain amount of it will be changed.
Yes. And I will say that a lot of the stuff I'm going to be saying is my favorite versions. So like because I don't have to, I'll leave it to Andy to deal with the alternate versions.
I'm totally happy to go. No,
like my favorite version is that humanity gets created and humanity is the tipping point for chaos. Humanity is a race that is so emotive, has so much connection. There's so many of them, they propagate so quickly that it is finally what gives chaos enough to tip the scales and they blow up the warp gates. And the halflings and ogres,
I would argue, if you're looking for the one that they've stated it's most going to be, just to give a counter argument, it would have been the elves, because they were the most emotional. And they had deep, abiding emotions that were so unlike any other species, so strong and so powerful that gods birthed around them, arguably. I
would agree, but counter argue that there weren't enough of them for chaos to be strong enough to blow the gates up yet. I think humanity's
or were they just destroyed by the coming of chaos?
That's fair. I think they were stuck on their little island. I think they were the old ones' prized golden retriever that they kept on their special little kennel,
in their little garden,
being taught magic on Lord Croak's lap.
I mean, even then, just saying that, if they were just on that island has got more than enough space to host 1 billion souls.
True. Yeah. Well, yeah. And there was definitely a lot more elves. There's probably more elves then than there ever was ever again. But sadly, but in any event, that doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Shit happened.
Yeah. So humanity exists, and there are a lot of humans in Cathay. There's a lot of human tribes, and they are all separate. So when chaos shows up around this time, the dragons throw themselves against the demons because they realize very quickly that chaos is not great. Chaos is a threat. It's like animals are like shifting into new kinds of animals. A lot of people have turned into beastmen. Shit's getting crazy. And the dragons start fighting against chaos, and Shen Yang and Quay go around and start unifying the human tribes. Now, it's not exactly clear how they unified them. It's likely a mixture of force on Shen Yang's part and pleas for unification and more diplomatic means on Quay Yin's part, but they unify a massive amount of human tribes. And Grand Cathay, because Grand Cathay is massive. It is a fucking huge country, almost the size of a continent. And when the dragons unite, they are not unstoppable by any means, but they are as close as you can be to it. And that Shen Yang and Quay Yin specifically are said to be so powerful that they are borderline godlike.
Yeah.
And because they're ancient, like they're both incredibly old. They understand magic very, very well, and they seem to adapt to what magic turns into, like the elves do. They adapt very quickly. Where it's like one of the things that dooms the lizard men in the early like first 1200 years of the war, is that the Slans struggle to get a handle on how magic has changed, because they're used to it being very precise and very specific, and chaos is very wibbly wobbly, and if you lose control of it, it makes you blow up. So
all the winds have gone mental, assuming they were winds to begin with.
Yeah, so the Dragon Kids, we can only imagine how insane and epic of a scale the conflicts were. Based on art we've seen, Shen Yang is said to be a massive golden dragon who's of incredible size and is able to go toe-to-toe with literally anything the Dark Gods can throw at them. Quay's out doing God knows what, and who knows what forms that she takes in battle, if she even participates in battle. I wouldn't actually be that surprised if Quay does not do direct conflict, but uses more subtle forms of fighting, which would actually be extremely useful against legions of demons, to be honest. And of course, their kids are participating. And what this culminates in is, while the Dragon River acts as a very nice natural border, there's this huge gap between Weijin and what we know as the ancient giant lands. These really, really scary, huge mountain range. And so the dragons, the chaos keeps flooding in mainly from the north, but also from the south. And the dragons just are holding them off. And then the vortex happens. So the dragons do not really manage to get anything going as far as building up new defenses until after the chaos is defeated. Or
a long time after.
Yeah. So thousands of years pass. Chaos is pushed back. A lot of magic floods out of the world, and apparently this leads to Cathay kind of forming, but maybe not necessarily being as big as it's going to become later as they start expanding further and further out. Because it's likely their empire probably got pushed in a lot by the demons.
Yeah, I mean, we've got very few actual dates around here beyond the Ogres becoming the Ogres and the Great Maw forming, which happens before the Bastion and the forming of Grand Cathay as we know it now. But there's some 2,500 years or so where shit is happening here, but the details that we have for the shit are scant. We're just aware that there is some shit happening in this area, and that Cathay definitely exists before it's all banded together into Grand Cathay.
Yes. So, yeah, like Andy said, literally the time between the birth of Sigmar and the modern time is how much time there is between the defeat of Chaos and the Ogre incident. So the Ogres. As far as how they interact with the dragon, the Ogres used to live in a beautiful verdant plain where there were large beasts that roamed, and the Ogres were a migratory species that followed the herds of beasts around, and life was good. And they were very strong allies, apparently, with Cathay. There are even legends and there are even legends about the Ogres standing side by side with Cathay during the time of demons.
It's worth adding a small note here. When the Ogres were completely updated, when the first Ogre Kingdoms army list were added, originally it was going to be Ogres and Halflings together, banding about doing their thing, but
that would have been adorable.
Nobblers instead. I
do like Nobblers, but yeah.
Nobblers are pretty cool too. And the Halfling connection to the Ogres was never removed. There was a lovely piece that was actually up on Games Workshop's website. It never actually hit anywhere else. I'm not sure if it ever hit anywhere else, but it was the discussion of the old ones creating near the very end of the war against chaos, halflings and ogres from the same material. They're basically the same sort of species, but split in two very different ways, both of which are consumed by their hungers, both of which have got a particular purpose that the old ones had for their greater plan, and that the ogres and halflings were both meant to be almost anti-chaos in many respects, but the halflings of all things were more successful in that they were almost entirely immune to chaos, where the ogres most certainly were not. But it was a last-ditch attempt, and the civilization that eventually becomes the Ogres came from that and was not the civilization that became the Ogre Kingdoms. They were a completely different type of species that were meant to be working hand in hand with another, in this particular case, probably the halflings. In some respects, consider them almost like the brain boys of 40k that were meant to be helping the orcs. The halflings, in many respects, were meant to be helping the ogres, but that sort of fell apart. And to this day, it's written into Warhammer 4th edition fantasy roleplay, halflings still corner Empire ogres across the Empire because the ogres just follow them. They do what they want.
And that is included in the
programmed into them.
they did include that in the 8th edition Ogre Kingdoms.
Oh, marvelous. Glad to
Also,
hear that.
Cleo, hello. I love your channel.
Hey!
You do awesome stuff. She's a history teacher in Australia. She's super awesome.
You rock. I've never met you, but you're brilliant.
Anyway, she plays a lot of Total War Warhammer. Anyway, so moving on. The Ogres apparently had a fairly good relationship with Cathay. They helped them fight versus a lot of things. And like I said, we have no idea what happened in these thousands of years. It's likely there was a lot of fighting against other forces. Because Chaos, while they were defeated and pushed back, there were a lot of different species that got empowered by Chaos because they formed bargains with the Dark Gods. The Dragon Ogres, for instance, a lot of humans, for instance, and who knows what other species. And there were beastmen everywhere. And in a lot of that vacuum that was left behind by Chaos suddenly vanishing, Greenskin started to show up like crazy. They just swarm into these gaps. So Cathay's busy fighting against a lot of these different various forces. And what ends up happening, we don't know what causes it, but there is some sort of schism between the Ogres and Cathay, most notably with Shen Yang. Something happens. We do have some notes that the Ogres become too populous, that there's not enough like natural predators, so to speak. And the Ogres, like deer, begin to their population explodes. And they are
as I recall from this section, don't they have a different emperor named, and you just basically have to pop the new emperor on top?
Yeah, there is actually so in Cathayan lore, there's a fun thing about this, which we will actually talk about in a little bit. There's a lot of
I don't know this.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun Cathay lore from the older editions, especially. Some actually get very, very specific and like name specific emperors.
Yep.
And so there's a note in the new Cathay lore that what happened apparently is that Shen Yang does not meet with anybody, pretty much. He very rarely deigns to bother with dignitaries from other nations or meet with anybody. So what happens is that a lot of people would meet Yuan Bo, or they would meet or they would meet a Shugegan, one of the descendants who we'll get into in a minute, and they would assume that person was the emperor. And the Cathayans very specifically do not correct them, either due to a mistranslation error or because the Cathayans are fine kind of wielding that power and that dynamic. So it has led to all these situations of other cultures thinking they have met the Celestial Dragon Emperor, and they go, oh, I met so-and-so, it's the Emperor, when in reality they met some smaller dignitary.
That could potentially be, although we've not moved that onto this yet, potentially dragon-blooded kids as well, who are being misunderstood by others, so they've been called emperors. I reckon you could write that pretty easily. That would work really well. And yeah, that works. Got it.
Yeah,
happy.
Yeah. So in any event, the only thing that we have says something along the lines of the Ogre Kingdoms book populates it, though hilariously it's told from a perspective of humans trying to understand what happened from the Empire, because the Ogres don't care. Like, they don't give a shit. It's in the past. Who cares? So what happens, supposedly, is that the Ogres grew too numerous and they begin eating the people of Cathay because they're hungry and they have grown so populated they are no longer able to survive easily just on the creatures they used to hunt. And some Ogres develop a particular taste for man flesh, which does sound like Ogres, to be fair.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah, so they start eating people and working their way into Cathay, and this infuriates the dragons. They see this as a betrayal, and Shen Yang, or probably more accurately, Yuan Bo, but we know Shen Yang was involved, calls upon the Celestial Court. So, like we said earlier, Shen Yang has a big old boner for Azir. He thinks Azir is the only wind of magic that humans should be allowed to wield. Shen Yang feels very strongly about this. He thinks that humans cannot be trusted with any of the other 7 winds of magic. Azir is the only one that it elevates their sense of being, and it's the only one that they can understand, that is pure enough that he feels comfortable with them learning it under his thumb. Where the Celestial Court is maintained under Yuan Bo specifically, and that is one of his main jobs, is to watch human wizards very carefully. And if you demonstrate any magical ability in Grand Cathay, you will be an astromancer, or else you are illegal. Flat out. which we'll get into. There's actually some fun stuff about that in a minute. But Shen Yang calls upon the Court of Astromancers and says, ogres, deal with them. I want them gone. So being Heaven's wizards, they do what every Heaven wizard does when a situation gets sticky. They throw a meteor at it. And this is where something very fun happens that I've talked about with Andy Hall, that there's no specifics about it. But one of the things I really like to think about is that when Shen Yang and all of his astromancers work together, they call upon the biggest meteor they can find. Because Shen Yang doesn't do it himself. He combines his power with his celestial court and Yuan Bo, who is the dragon of the meteor wind, or the stone dragon. So he is naturally affiliated with Azir. And all together, they reach out and grab the biggest son of a bitch they can find and turn it so that it's going to hit the ogres.
So I've got a question. Because this is a part that I know very well from the Ogre Kingdom side, but don't really know in terms of how it's been updated. Has this actually been updated, or is this all supposition? Because as I recall, it was originally, and again, this is running back to my old memories of it, but as I recall, it was just the Astromancers that pulled it all down. There was no connection at all to the Emperor. It was by the Emperor's command, but it wasn't the Emperor that did it. Is this something that's been updated, or is this something that you have to update to make it make any real sense, given that the Astromancers are yet to even really become a thing properly yet?
Yeah,
so Grand Cathay is yet to exist.
I will say I am 100% sure that the Celestial Court is involved, so the Astromancers, and Yuan Bo is involved. I am 50% sure Shen Yang himself was involved.
Yeah.
I'd have to triple check that. He may have just ordered it, but at the very least, Yuan Bo and a shit ton of Astromancers were involved. But what I talked to Andy Hall about that I like a lot is that they make a mistake, which is that they call upon all this magic and they call out the biggest rock they can find, but they don't realize what it's made out of. And I think that Tzeentch gets involved here, because Tzeentch, or as the Cathayans know him, Xianxi, he is the primary antagonist god to Grand Cathay. He is a big old there's some notes in the new Cathayan lore that Tzeentch finds the orderliness and the harmony of Cathay and its resistance to the corrupting influence of chaos because of how regimented it is to be a particularly fascinating challenge. And he is very, very obsessed with sticking his fingers in as much as he can. The other three gods have significantly less influence in Grand Cathay than Tzeentch does, where the cults of Xianxi are said to be rampant and very difficult to deal with. So I think that Tzeentch pulls a tricky on them, and that because they use all this magic, they dip so deeply into the winds, kind of out of arrogance and also not being as careful as they should have been, that they pull down a warpstone meteor instead of pulling down a natural meteor. And this has devastating ramifications because what they pull down is warpstone, which is just raw dark magic. And they pull down a shitload of it. It is the biggest meteor that has ever impacted the Warhammer world that we know of, because its effects are insane. Where it hits the heartland of the Ogre Empire, and it wipes out 2/3 of the Ogre species in an instant. Asteroid, yes, sorry. Technical terms. And this warpstone meteor, when it impacts the planet, something really weird happens, which is that when it kills 2/3 of the ogres, some kind of feedback happens where the warpstone meteor seems to almost either absorb the ogre's souls, or it resonates with them, but something happens where the ogres have an effect on the meteor and the meteor has an effect on the ogres.
Yep.
And what that causes is that the meteor becomes a living embodiment of the ogre's worst desires, their worst impulses, and it becomes a giant mouth. And it eats its way into the planet like a parasite, and it eats all the way through till it pops out the other side, where it is still a mouth, and it's literally just a giant mouth. There's
the other side of the world is a huge whirlpool.
Yes, because it comes up in the ocean.
The other side, massive whirlpool.
The Maelstrom.
The Maelstrom, that's the one.
Yep, or the Galleon's Graveyard, as it's also known. So, and the ogres are almost entirely wiped out. What does survive of them are on the non-Cathayan side of this crater, and the entirety of their homeland is incinerated by a warpstone fireball. So not only is it incinerated, but it is irradiated with magic. Where even today, thousands and thousands and thousands of years later, you cannot go there without very, very special precautions like modern Cathayans use, where modern Cathayans, when they take caravans into the Warpstone Desert, they cover themselves in very special suits, and they line up their caravans with these really big like silver mirrors that reflect the raw magic away from them, because otherwise it's literally like walking into like the worst of Chernobyl. Like you're just gonna die horribly.
I'm going to add an extra little detail here, because it's largely the theme of what I've been doing.
Yes.
This particular piece of lore was added before Cathay, as we understand it now, was added. And Cathay has obviously changed, become something new, and in turn that piece of lore has been gently speckled with different ideas. I think it's extremely likely that this event in particular will be rewritten. Of all of them, this is one of the ones that's most likely to be. The event will still be the same. It will be the pulling down of something, and that something might be given a new angle. It will hit, it will cause the Warpstone Deserts, it will cause the irradiation, it will create these super cool caravans that make their way through it, because that's awesome. And it will create the modern version of the politics that lie between the Ogre Kingdoms and Grand Cathay. All those key parts will exist, but the specifics are exceedingly likely to be rewritten. So be aware that if you're watching this video, for example, a year down the line from now, it's very likely that when the army lists come out for the old world, that all of this will be changed, that Grand Cathay will probably be pitched back far further than it currently is in the Total War game, to ensure that they can accommodate all of the Ogre Kingdom events and also accommodate all the ideas for Grand Cathay being arguably the oldest human civilization that exists on the planet. Because as it currently stands, it's not. What it is, with its formation minus 1,800 years ago, it's far from being the oldest. And that's clearly nonsense, because it is.
Yeah, well, it's like even with the lore we have now, it doesn't make any sense of that. There was a court of astromancers that were centralized enough that they pulled off this insane feat, and yet the founding of the nation does not happen for like another 900 or like another 1,100 years.
Yeah, that clearly doesn't make any sense. So that's all going to get massaged like a big bit of dough to try and bake a slightly different version of the bread and ensure that it all makes sense. Because whenever someone writes a new army list, that timeline is one of the fun bits when you try to make sense of it all.
Yeah. Is the hole still visible? Oh yeah. Yeah. The Great Maw. It's a giant mouth in the ground. If you go play Total War Warhammer 3 and you walk over to it, you can see it. It's gross. It has a bunch of hilarious effects and like sound effects and stuff. It's great.
Yeah.
So in any event, that happens, and this basically turns Western Cathay into a big desert. A lot of it is a really hellscape desert, but on the plus side, it kind of makes Cathay's western border damn near unapproachable for a very long time. Which was probably not the goal. The goal was just to get rid of the ogres. The Great Maw was definitely not the intent. But we will come back to the Great Maw in a little bit, because it does actually have a role to play in the more modern stuff. So after this, about 900 years pass, and the founding of Grand Cathay likely took place before the Maw incident, but in minus 1800, a very big event happens, which is the completion of the Great Bastion. So the Great Bastion, giant wall, it's fucking huge. If you've seen it in Total War and stuff, it is absolutely colossal.
A quarter of a mile high. It's proper huge.
Yeah, it stretches all the way from Wei-Jin, the Celestial City, all the way over to the Ancient Giant Lands, to make the border completely impassable, because the dragons get very, very sick of all of these chaos tribes constantly invading through their borders, and they're finally like, enough is enough. We're creating a wall. And the wall has a couple of notable things about it, which is, first, this wall is not just a mundane wall that is a quarter of a mile high. It is exceedingly magical. on 2 different levels. The first is that that is very likely.
Yeah, I think that's very likely. When much like Sigma are bound together, all the tribes of man, when Grand Cathay comes together, it's when all the tribes of Cathay are pulled together and it becomes Grand Cathay.
Yeah. The Great Maw is very fleshy, and it literally goes all the way through the planet.
And its original description, it's not. And its original description, it's a crater. It's not a crater. It's a pit. It just drops down into darkness. There's no real flesh in it at all. Total War reimagined it in a slightly different way. There's lots of stories of creatures moving down and attempting to make their way down, but the further down you went, amongst the sort of ragged, empty stone.
In the 8th edition Ogre Kingdoms book, it's said to be fleshy, and it has
fleshy in that.
It has like teeth and spikes sticking out of it. And it rumbles the earth so people will fall in so it can eat them.
Which is, of course, awesome.
Yes. So like ogres make pilgrimages to the Great Maw. And it always talks about that it's actually very dangerous because when they get to the edge so they can look down into it, the Maw will try to suck them in so it can eat them. Because, lovely God. Yes, its other end is the Galleon's Graveyard. I would not think it's a butt. I think it's literally just mouth all the way through. Remember, it's not an actual living creature. It's a horrible mutated amalgamate god. It's a mad god. It's not a creature. It's something. Calling it a creature is a oversimplification, I feel. But in any event, so the Great Bastion gets made, and the Great Bastion has 2 noble things about it. The first is that it is forged through incredibly magical means by the 3 male dragon children. So Zhao Ming, the Iron Dragon, Yuan Bo, the Heaven's Dragon or the Meteor Dragon of the Meteor Wind, and Li Dao, the Fire Dragon, all join up under their father's guidance to make the wall. Where it is said that I think it's that Yuan Bo creates the bricks, and then Li Dao burns them with his fire, and then Zhao Ming blesses them with his amazing smith abilities and the iron wind to bless them and make them like impenetrable. And they do that to every single brick. This probably took them thousands of years, or at least hundreds. It probably took a really freaking long time, even with all of their magic. And so they build up this wall. And when it's complete, a very important thing happens because it has all these magical defenses. But what Shen Yang does at this point is a very interesting part of his character, where Shen Yang has devised this insanely powerful device known as the Wu-Xing Compass, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second. But what Shen Yang does is he pours his very essence into the Great Bastion. So the Great Bastion is functionally a part of Shen Yang. And it's to a very extreme extent where if the Great Bastion were ever to be destroyed, it would very likely kill Shen Yang because so much of his essence is poured into it to make it an impenetrable barrier.
And if you want to see something similar, consider what happened with Shiyama earlier. With Shiyama in the Spirit River. So there's definitely connections between the 2 of them there.
Yeah, like father, like daughter. So, and the Great Bastion, it is probably the most insane like construction in the Warhammer world, or very, very close to it.
I can't think of anything bigger off the top of my head. It's proper mental.
It's like, not only is it massive, but it can literally repel the very winds themselves. Like the winds of magic cannot penetrate the Great Bastion. So like, that's why demon armies are actually quite rare in Grand Cathay, because they have a very hard time. The winds that blow out of the north don't make it into Grand Cathay very easily. It's very, very difficult. It has to only come over from the mountains or up from the south or out of the east over the ocean, which are just not generally how the winds of magic work. And what the Dragon Emperor does at this point is, at some point, we don't know exactly when, he constructs his magnum opus, which is the Wu-Xing Compass, also known as the Jade Compass.
Yep.
So the Jade Compass, or the Wu-Xing Compass, is literally, it looks like a giant compass up in the Celestial City. So it's up in the Flying City. You can actually see it in Yuan Bo's intro cinematic. But it's this giant edifice that's very, very complex. It's like got all these meticulous gears, and every little piece of it is inscribed with magic. And what it does is Jade apparently absorbs the winds of magic like crazy. It draws magic to it and just eats it up. It's a very, very strong gatherer of the winds of magic. And what he built was this massive compass that draws all the winds of magic to it up in the Celestial City. All the magic that would try and go through the Great Bastion or try and go over the Dragon River is instead brought up into the Jade Compass. And the Dragon Emperor is able to direct it where he wants. So he's able to pull on levers, or levers, if you prefer, that change where the compass is pointing. And where the compass points, it directs the flow of magic to that place, which as a feat of magical engineering is fucking nuts. Like, that is a bonkers level of control over the winds of magic.
You tend to find that with a lot of Grand Cathay's lore, that it's proper big.
Yeah, as far as human nations go, I think they've got magical dominance in the bag.
Yeah.
But so what Shen Yang does is that although in Total War you can point the compass a lot of different places, generally speaking in the lore, he seems to only really point it in one of two places, which is that he flows the Yang aspects of the winds of magic. So the winds of fire, azir, life, and light. He flows those into the Great Bastion to empower it. And then the lore of Yin, which is death, shadow, beasts, and metal, he funnels into the spirit, the Dragon River. And that's what allows them to maintain their magical strength, because magic does fade over time, which is something the dwarves have learned to their cost. Of that, if you're going to rely on magical defenses, you need to be able to re-empower them, either reconsecrate them or find ways to keep the magic going into them so that they stay operational. So that's what Shen Yang spends a lot of his time doing, is redirecting the winds into these two grand designs of his, which protect the northern border from the predations of chaos, which is interesting. Pretty neat.
It's pretty neat. Love it.
Yeah. And that pretty much covers a lot with the parents. The only other thing that's worth talking about is that about 2,000 years after, actually 3,000 years after this, so after the formation of Sigmar, the dragon parents, they're doing their stuff, but apparently they've been working on something. We don't know what, but yes. Shen Yang and Quay Yin have been scheming, and they've been making some kind of plan of their own, kind of in an ironic twist, much like the old ones who they disparage quite heavily. And it's worth noting, Andy's kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think it's worth diving into now. The dragons do not like the gods. They do not like the old ones. They hate them. The dragons are so anti-god that Shen Yang has he has made it a very specific doctrine in Cathay that worship is considered, like, worship of gods is illegal.
Yep.
You cannot worship spirits. You cannot worship gods. They tolerate kind of the worship of dragons, but it's not worship like the old worlders.
Somewhat of a
thing they do allow ancestor worship, and the worship of the dragons is permitted, but it's it's more like reverence than worship. Like it's not like there's no priests, there's no like leading of ceremonies, there's no organized religion. It's a very personal experience, or a very familial experience.
The entirety of Grand Cathay is a far more atheistic society that is based upon people working together towards the betterment of all and harmony. It's a far grander design in that regard, but it's not about gods, and gods either being something to worship or something to fear. Gods are very much other people's problems and other people's issues, not a Grand Cathay one. Having said that, though, we all know that's a bit of a lie, given that there's chaos cults that pass all the way through. Gods do exist and they're out there. I imagine that if they ever reach the point where a role-playing game comes in here, it's going to be massively muddied, because no matter what the grand design is, the reality on the ground is almost always something different.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure there are like small cults that do worship gods, but they have to be very quiet about it because it's probably it's not it's not going to be
it's
tolerated.
illegal. Exactly.
Yeah.
The heart of all these games ultimately is conflict, and conflict can't occur. There would be no need for them to outlaw worship of gods if it didn't happen. It just it wouldn't be something they needed to do. So,
and I will say for this, the word prayer can have kind of different connotations. I do not think they mean it in the sense where they're literally going like this, but more of a benediction to their ancestors. Because you have to remember, the dragons are the ancestors of the Shugans.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go a little bit further on this one. We as a people, particularly those of us over in the West, have got a view that the gods are something to be worshipped. But that's not the case in the Warhammer world. Most of the gods, except for the Chaos gods who really adore that shit, but most of the gods are not there gagging for worship. Instead, they are almost, they're otherworldly entities that you fear. So it's not so much you're worshipping them, you're asking them not to curse you, not to do something bad against you. There's a famine out, so you ask the god of fertility, whichever one it is according to your local culture, to please stop whatever it is that they're doing and do something else. It's not so much that you're sending a prayer out to a god to worship it. It's nothing more than a communication. And when you make a prayer to the dragons, to your ancestors, you're merely asking them for help. It's not worship at all. They are indeed their leaders. It's nothing more than, I hope the dragons are there today watching over me while I go and do things that help society and keep everyone bound together. Worship and prayer are two quite different things in the Warhammer world, and indeed in the real world.
Yeah, so at this point, I think it's good to pivot into a couple of topics about the dragons themselves, because that is the focus of this. And
I'd just like to bring up this one. I'm hearing a faint echo as well at my side, and I've literally no idea where it's coming from. So, I heard this last week too.
And I will say, I don't hear an echo on this. I'm curious if anyone on YouTube hears a slight echo, or if that's only at Twitch. That might be a Twitch problem, not a stream problem.
I'm hearing it, which is, yes, I might be just catching something from maybe your headphones and your mic. Maybe it's just catching the edge of the sound coming through.
Maybe
let's find out. Can I hear it now?
So YouTube doesn't hear anything.
No, the echoes just disappeared when you moved away.
Okay. So you know what? I'll just lean a little further
back. Your
mic
is that sensitive that it was catching my voice in your headphones.
Okay, so I'll just lean further back. I'll just hang out back here. A couple interesting things about the Dragon Kids that now we're going to get into the really spicy, fun stuff. So the first is that we've kind of mentioned them a couple times, but we do need to talk about them. Actually, okay, so finishing up the god discussion, one of the other things is that for the dragons, they do not even see hating the gods as like, it's not like a hatred of these equals. It is more they see them as parasites. They're
no different to demons.
Yeah, and that's the big thing. The dragon, the Cathayan dragons look over and they go, those aren't gods. Like, they call themselves gods, but we remember a time before they existed. And if they weren't around, then they're literally just big demons. Like,
in some respects, they are nothing more than what has been destroying their world. And whilst they may be pitched against each other to a degree in that there's good gods and bad gods, or if you want, it's all chaos anyway, it doesn't really matter. They are a disruptive force that make demands upon people and do terrible things, something that lies beyond the harmony that the dragons themselves are looking to install. Yeah,
and one of the interesting things with the dragons relating to the gods is that they go very out of their way to really disdain the gods and view them as very lesser creatures. And a lot of that is because the dragons understand that the gods need worship. They need these mortals to actively worship them and pray to them and have this relationship with them. And the dragons go, well, we don't need that. That's a crutch. That shows that they're weaker than us.
I would say that is, to give a slightly counteractive view, only one way of viewing the gods. And that the gods themselves have been depicted in the Warhammer world in multiple different ways. And whilst that is that is a commonly understood belief, particularly because that was how the old Realms of Chaos books depicted it, all the way back for, say, for example, 3rd edition Warhammer, 1st edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Later books have often given quite a different view for how the gods work and different perspectives. Indeed, some gods which had died out and have no worshippers at all have not only existed and continued to exist, have actually come back without a single worshipper at all, just as powerful as they were before. So it's a bit more complicated than that alone, while simultaneously I think it's worth saying that is kind of true. And one way of giving you a counter argument to my counter argument would be to say that in the realm of the gods and the aether and that place that lies beyond, there isn't really time as we understand it.
Yeah, it gets really mindfucky over there.
Yeah, it really does. And that allows something that has potentially got no current worship to exist. For example, it's quite possible that one of the gods of the Warhammer world, as we understand it just now, hasn't actually even been born yet, but has had worshippers since the beginning of time building up towards it. It's a complicated set of affairs.
Yeah, go watch the LAWhammer series if you want to know more about that. It's awesome. Delving into that, and there is one of the fun things is there is kind of a sense of hypocrisy with the dragons, in that while the dragons may not acknowledge it, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that they, despite the fact that they try to outlaw it, are being worshipped by humans.
It's almost start. I mean, humans do
and
it,
they are benefiting from power that comes with that, because worship is a powerful force in Warhammer, whether people realize it or not.
Yeah, and I think that that's worth mentioning directly here, because yes, I agree completely. The reverence, though, again, isn't worship. It's not that they're worshipping them as gods. They are fucking godlike entities that not only control every aspect of their lives, which they do, they are enormously powerful. They're not sitting like a prime minister or a king or a leader of any other type. They are quite literally godlike entities that can leap off buildings, fall down, turn into giant dragons, eat entire armies, fly back again and go, well, that was a handy afternoon. Excellent. That's not just going to bring reverence. That's going to bring terror. That's going to bring love. That's going to bring worship and adoration, but not as a god. It's going to be nothing more than pure the pure awesomeness of what they are being reflected in how people react to them. So I agree that you're absolutely spot on here, but I still don't think it is necessarily tied directly through to worship.
Yeah. So moving away from the god discussion, the other thing that's really important about the dragons is we've mentioned them a few times, being the Shugegan. So Shugegan,
we get the other dragons out, because we haven't gone through all of them yet.
Oh yeah, thank you.
It'd be worth to get the other ones in, just to make sure we got them, because then we can go into our dragon blooded folks, because that is just super fascinating.
Yeah. So the Dragon Children, just kind of doing a brief touch on them, and then there's a couple of them we'll hit more specifically on. So we already talked a fair bit about Shiyama, the spirit dragon. Then there is Yuan. So Yuan, who of course is getting a lot of focus at the moment, is the dragon of the meteor winds, also known as the stone dragon. So he is the one associated with Azir, and he is the grand administrator of Great Cathay, is his public title. And what's very interesting about Yuan is he is very duplicitous among all of them. He has a double life, where even his siblings, despite the fact they've known him for thousands of years, do not fully comprehend what it is exactly he's up to a lot of the time, because he sits as the public head of Great Cathay. He talks to his father and his mother a lot. He hangs, because he is in charge of both the Celestial City, so the capital of Great Cathay, and the central provinces. So he controls 2 of the great provinces that make up Great Cathay instead of just 1, like his siblings. And
think of him like the big grand vizier that holds everything together. Where the rest of his siblings are all on the extreme. Quite literally, they're out on the periphery doing peripheral things, and they are, in comparison, far less balanced than he is. He sits in the middle, standing in the center of the scales, and is considered to be, loosely, the safe hand. Yeah.
His father and mother trust him more than anybody else.
Absolutely.
Because he's given all the secret missions. to the point where Shen Yang has actually gone so far as to tell Yuan Bo some of the plan they're working on, which they don't share with anybody. And Quay Yin allows him to utilize the Onyx Crowmen, which are her spies. They are her eyes and ears. And he is the spy master of Grand Cathay. He is also the Grand Administrator. He sets out all the edicts. He sets the laws. He interprets the words of his father and mother, and he goes to his siblings and he says, this is what's legal, this is what's illegal. Now, they might not listen to what he tells them, which is a cause of conflict between the siblings, which, siblings, what are you going to do? But in secret, he is also the Emperor's executioner. His job is to go out and kill who needs to be killed. And Yuan Bo is not so subtly a force of repression as well as a force of law, which is kind of what law exists to do a lot of the time. If there are rebellions, Yuan Bo will often show up, and nobody will know he's there. Everyone thinks he's still back in Central Cathay or in Weijin or Shengwu doing his paperwork, because he loves his paperwork. But in reality, he shows up on a battlefield and there's all these peasants rebelling, and he just goes, okay, y'all are dead. I don't care about y'all. You're nothing to me. He balances the scales, and he will maintain harmony, whatever it takes.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. The judge.
Yeah. And yes, he is the Jade Dragon, which fun fact about the Dragon Kids, their colors are a little weird. And it's because
let's just stop thinking about that too much.
Yeah, I will say the reason for it is because Games Workshop made a weird decision where they wanted to base the Dragon Children off a real world mythology concept, which are the great beasts of Chinese mythology, which there's a north, east, south, west, and central beast. And the north beast is black in color. So Miao Ying is a black dragon, even though she's the dragon of life. But they're like, oh, it's the storm dragon, so she's black like the color of storm clouds. All right, fine. Then you have, then you have the east dragon, Yin-yin, who we'll talk a little bit more in a moment, is Azure, even though she's the beast dragon, but she's associated with the ocean. So all right, we'll let that slide.
Let that go.
Yeah. Then there's the western dragon, Zhao Ming, who is based on the white beast, so he is white in color, but iron.
Alchemy,
silvery, I guess. And then south is the only one that really makes sense, which is Li Dao the fire dragon, who's red.
Perfect.
Yeah. But in the mythology, the central beast is gold or yellow, but Games Workshop decided to make Shen Yang the gold dragon. So Yuan Bo didn't have a color at that point, so they decided to make him Jade, because Jade is the most it's practically holy as a material. Yeah. It is quite literally stated to be Shen Yang's favorite material on the planet, and it has a lot of very strong magical properties. And the other thing about Yuan Bo is that when it comes to he is the most powerful sorcerer of the 5 Dragon Children. He's not necessarily the best fighter per se, but he is the most powerful wizard among the children. It's very explicitly stated that.
Yep.
Which him being Jade likely has a lot to do with that, even though Jade is a very strange color for Lore of Heavens, but you know what? Whatever, we're moving on. It's a gemstone, I guess.
Let's go on to Yin-yin, because I like Yin-yin.
Yes, so we have Yin-yin, who has a lot of really, really cool lore. Because Yin-yin has actually, much to her sadness, I suspect, inherited a lot of the old Cathayan lore.
Yeah.
Where Yuan Bo kind of took over a lot of the old this is the Celestial Dragon Emperor. No, it's actually just Yuan Bo. Yin-yin is the Grand Admiral of the Dragon Fleet. She is the Sea Dragon, and she is associated with the Wind of Beasts. And despite the fact that she also represents the elemental wind of wood, which granted, that seems to mean in the concept of the beasts of the wood. There are creatures in the wood. She represents all the beasts. Granted, there's lots of terrifying beasts to be found in the ocean as well, so I don't think she minds too much. But Yin-yin, from what we know about her, she seems to be the most ambitious and also borderline stupid, but in a loving way.
An unfortunate assault.
Yeah, of the Dragon Children. She is what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word that always comes to mind, and I'm forgetting it, where she's very aggressive, Because she wants.
Impetuous is what I
Yes,
think
she's
might be
very
the word.
impetuous. Yes,
Yes.
that's it.
She's also very outward looking in comparison to the other dragons as well. In that, if you take a look through her provinces, it's where you'll see the most foreigners, the most outsiders who've been allowed in, and that includes a whole host of foreigners that we've yet to have really detailed, that have strong relations because of presumably trade routes that make their way in through her cities. So yeah.
Yeah, so Grand Cathay, a lot of it borders the ocean, and she is in charge of all of that, which is known as the Eastern Province. And like Andy said, they have a massive amount of foreign districts. The capital of Yin-Yin's province is Fushao, which is a huge city. It is said to be the most populated city in all of Grand Cathay because it has so many foreigners in it. There's like an entire dwarf quarter, an empire quarter, a quarter for the elves of Ulthuan, a quarter of Bretonians, a quarter of Talaeans and Estalians. Like, it is packed with people.
As it currently stands, it's quite likely it's the largest city in the known world. The most obvious counterpoint would be something like Marienburg sitting over in the old world, and another extraordinarily cosmopolitan city with people from across the world, including people from Cathay, people from Nippon. And I think that it's quite possible that this city is even larger. If you're looking for scales, you're possibly looking at well beyond 1 million, and possibly even more than that. They're not huge by modern examples of cities, but they're nevertheless huge.
Yeah, and that's not the only one. There are, I want to say, like 4 or 5 very large port cities.
Off the top of my head, I need to look at the map, but yes.
And she's in charge of all of them. Her cities are said to be very cosmopolitan, and because they just have all these different things, and they're trade centers, and a lot of the cultures are interweaving, and Yin-Yin very much embraces that because it's money. She is also the wealthiest of the 5 that are still around, the 5 dragon chids.
It's interesting when you look at them all, because she's almost certainly the most. Now, I'm going to use this word with a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek awareness that it's a very difficult word to use here, but powerful. In that she has access to a large military, an enormous navy, which has perhaps not always gone the way it should do. She's got access to extraordinary funds. She's got access to probably the largest taxation out of everybody, the largest populations. And while she might not be responsible for creating the law, she might not be gaining all the glory that you might get for sitting up in the north. She might not be doing all the study that you might get from others. What she is, without any comparison, really, is bright, alive, and very much in the thick of it in comparison to some of the other ones.
Yeah, I expect she kind of leads from the front, though I actually have a very strong theory that she's probably a bow wielder most of the time, because Yin-Yin. So the thing with each of the dragon kids is they all have a very distinct relationship with their parents, where we've talked a little bit about Yuan Bo. He's very balanced. Yin-Yin, hilariously enough, is actually the dragon child who is probably the most yin of the 5, next to maybe Yuan Bo, but she has a very unique relationship with Yin, where she's not as much like the Olgu and Shaiish. She's far more the beasts and like metal. She's far more of the more impulsive aspects that might come with Yin, the more emotive. I think she's very emotive.
It's interesting because that'd normally be the judging by the classical winds rather than the Eastern winds, depending upon how you wish to define these. That would normally be directly associated with the bright wind, that impulsivity.
Oh, we'll get to him.
Burn and thrush.
We'll get to him.
And it's quite fun to see them bringing in extra aspects, not just of the winds, but to their characters, and not relying on the winds alone to define them.
Yeah, I would say Yin-Yin has a really fun relationship as the Dragon of Beasts, because she very much gives off this feeling of that like when she gets on the hunt, she is relentless, which is good when you're out there fighting against Dark Elf Black Arcs and Nipponese fleets and the fleets of End, the War Dows of the Kingdoms of End. She deals with a lot of threats from the ocean. She also has to negotiate, and is probably a very aggressive negotiator. Yeah. And like Andy said, she wields a ton of authority. Like, one of the things that's very interesting is, even with all of Yuan Bo's might, the Sea Dragon Edict is a very powerful thing, because she gives you the right to come into a port. Yuan Bo cannot grant you the right to come into the ports of Grand Cathay. That's up to Yin-yin, which means that's a significant amount of power.
Also, for all of her impulsivity, you get a sense that she's not as, for example, stuck in with humanity as another dragon we're about to move on to most definitely is. So you get that a sense that she's probably going to be, given where she is, a slightly more distant figure, contrary to what you might expect. One that is perhaps more ambassadorial, who has more actual thoughts going on, but also behind that all, given some of the choices she's made, she might be a bit angry. She might have a bit of a temper when things don't go her way. So there's definitely lots of aspects to her character that are potentially there that have yet to be explored in any of the particular outlets that we have so far.
So real quick, Banda, love your mini. Hate your arrival in the end times, but I appreciate you for the all cap super chat. But so the reason for that is very heavily stated to be that Tzeentch tends to take Cathay as a very personal challenge and seems to delight in investing heavily in disrupting that harmony. Whereas that harmony actually, like, the other gods are definitely there. They have cults, undeniably, within Grand Cathay, but they have a harder time taking purchase because of the way that Cathayan society is structured. They're definitely there. And one thing we'll talk about is that they're probably more present in certain places in Grand Cathay than others. But from what lore we have now, it seems to mostly be that Tzeentch is kind of the ever-present threat, whereas I bet the ports, the cosmopolitan ports, probably have a lot of Slaaneshi influence.
Yeah, definitely. What you'll find is that what we're currently dealing with is a society seen through the lens of a single game. That single game has got aspects of it that are important for that game, and also aspects of it that the writers behind it will also be interested in reinforcing. As that is moved over towards other games, for example, the old world, when it comes, the prevalence of chaos and exactly how chaos is presented in that game, they will go through every society at various points, and they will ensure that all the gods are mentioned in there, because they do pretty much every single time. And if Old World kicks off, we're going to get a bunch of novels that are going to completely contradict everything that we think we know as it comes up. So I would say that, yes, definitely on the top tier when you're looking.
We may have just lost Andy for a second. Hopefully that will sort itself out in a sec. Chat, can y'all still see me? Say something. Hold on. Let me message him. Okay. So, we'll give Andy a second and I will keep talking. But yes, no, the other cults are definitely active. They are definitely they definitely appear, to the extent that Kugoth Plaguefather is actually a known threat within Grand Cathay. He's known as Zenfa to the Cathayans. That's Kugoth's name over there, and he has been kind of a present threat. Yeah, gods didn't like Andy talking about him. Let's see, another super chat here. Hieronymus talking about the dragons, dragon-blooded humans. Aberrash drank every last drop of blood of a dragon. In theory, is he now something akin to a Shugegan? I will also get Andy's take on this, but I suspect that there is a notable difference. I would say that there's a very notable difference between consuming the blood of a dragon, taking the blood of a dragon into you, which seems to balance out the elixir that is present within the that is like the flaw within the vampiric curse, versus being born part dragon. I would not call Aberrash a Shugegan. Like, he does not likely have dragon blood coursing through his veins. He consumed dragon blood, which seemed to, due to its magical nature, have a very strong interaction and influence with the magic that moves his body around and allows his body to, be active and have the powers that it does. But I would not say that he is a Shugegan. And I'm just gonna did we lose ya? But dang, hopefully Andy comes back soon because we're just getting into the super fun bits. How are y'all? Hello. Quick break. How's everybody doing? I'm sure he'll be back in a moment. But I will now take questions. How about that? If y'all have any questions. The Wu-Xing Compass is pointed away from Andy's house. Yeah, someone needs to change the compass back. Please send the Winds of Magic to Andy. He needs them. But we'll get him back in a second. I knew it was going to happen one day. It had to happen eventually. Yeah, intermission. Get up and stretch your legs. Get some water. You know, drink some stuff. You have a replacement, Andy, for me? Hold on. Let me see if I can put this up on the screen. Because it's funny to me. Yes, I can. Hold on. We can have this going while we're waiting for Andy to return. Where is it? Oh God, which one is it? Which one is it? There it is. There you go. You can have Andy doing the dragon dance while we're waiting for a moment. Oh Jesus. So while Andy's doing the dragon dance for us, let's see. Okay, some questions came in. Let's see. Do I think the Dragon Kids got their revenge on Kraken Rock off screen during the end times? Could be. I mean, Kraken Rock was rampaging around somewhere. Could be that maybe Kraken Rock had an epic final battle with Shen Yang and the two killed each other. Who could say? Do we know what powers the human dragon children have outside of a strong connection to magic? Yes, they are longer lived than humans. They are in many ways physically stronger than humans. They're just better. Having dragon blood in their veins just makes them better in a variety of ways. Because dragon blood has a lot of very strong influences. Like, you know, to the point where dragon blood is so mighty that it can cure the curse of vampirism, in the sense that it gets rid of the thirst for blood and makes you even more powerful. But yeah, that definitely seems to kind of be the interesting thing there. Why does the Galleon's graveyard spew so much dark magic, and why doesn't it drink the ocean? It does. The Galleon's graveyard does drink the ocean, but it also vomits it back up, because it's literally Charybdis from the myth of Odysseus, right? Where it's this massive whirlpool that pulls in. The Galleon's graveyard is not easy to find. You can actually only find it during specific times of like magical confluence, and it draws in all of the dead. Like everything that dies in the ocean is slowly but surely drawn into the Great Maw. The Great Maw absorbs all of this dead stuff, every wrecked ship, every creature that dies at sea, every person that dies at sea, and it eventually devours them. But then it's constantly barfing them back up. So it is a realm of death. But death, especially stagnant death like that, draws immense amount of dark magic to it. It's actually one of like the largest locuses of dark magic to be found anywhere in the world. Is the Celestial Dragon Emperor a cat person? Well, there is a event/legend about cats involving the Celestial Dragon Emperor and the Moon Empress. So yes, I would say they are cat people, because there's a whole cat thing. Yep, we did talk about the Moon Empress is an alien. Very true. She's a shapeshifter. She's not a dragon. She's a shapeshifter that takes the form of a dragon. Will Kugoth be active in End? Kugoth has been active probably everywhere. It's Kugoth. He gets around. He really likes being in the mortal planes. Kugoth likes being in the mortal realms, our reality, more than he likes being in the realm of chaos, which is a little unusual. It's not like crazy necessarily for demons to prefer that. A lot of demons do enjoy many of the sensations and such of the mortal realms, but most demons kind of feel like they spend most of their time in the realm of chaos. Kugoth actually spends the most of his time in the mortal realms because he's constantly looking for new ingredients and testing out his new plagues and diseases on people to see stuff. Let's see. I've got 20 different Andys on speed dial. I wish. Listen, I only know 4 Warhammer Andys. Just on the news, the Great Maw is eating Scotland. Well, we'll have to give an F in chat for Andy. F in chat for Andy. Let's see here. What other? We're just doing chats here. What is my take on the character Shiyama, the Spirit Dragon? She's said to be the first of all the Dragon Children. I think Shiyama is fascinating. I wish there was a little more on her. I love the idea that the Spirit Dragon or the Death Dragon is first, and that she also died very, very quickly. It opens a lot of great questions. I will admit it does kind of put a hole in my theory that she was killed by the Ogres, which I was really, really fond of that theory because I like the idea that the Ogres managed to kill and potentially eat one of the Dragon Children, and that is what pushed Shen Yang over the edge and led to him retaliating against the Ogres by throwing a meteor at them, or the Great Maw at them. That to me made a lot of sense, and it could be that is still what happened. Just we have to like fix some timeline issues for that to be the case. But it also opens the interesting idea that maybe, Shiyama died willingly. Maybe she sacrificed herself or Shen Yang sacrificed her. But like there was some decision made so that she could empower the Dragon River. Who could say? Let's see. Okay. Andy just messaged me. He said his internet has died, trying to see if he can connect on mobile. Let me see. Let me send him in case you need. We're getting him back. Maybe the lizardman falling out or dragon ogres killed her. Yeah, that's very true. It could be that she was killed by dragon ogres. A dragon ogre Shaggoth killing her would make a lot of sense. There's a lot of animosity between dragons and dragon ogres. They hate each other. Those races have been fighting each other for like countless eons. So that would definitely make a lot of sense. But and the lizardman doing it would be fascinating. That would be very, very interesting if it was the lizardman that struck her down. That would open like a whole bunch of cans of worms. There he is. I see him. Okay, he's working. He's coming. He's making his way in. She was killed by the fishman. Oh my god, it all makes sense now. It all makes sense now.
Hello.
There he is.
So I'm currently on my iPad because my internet has gone down. Roadworks outside have apparently destroyed my internet. So nice. I'm currently I'm tethered over to a mobile over there, which may run out of battery, but as it stands, I'm here.
All right.
Funny angle. Look at me.
Yeah. So, all right. So we're gonna hit. I'm gonna hit the gas now on stuff. Because we're. Everyone in chat was like, "The Great Maw got Andy. Scotland's going down." Oh my gosh. So Yin-yin, yes, Lore of Beast Dragon. She's blue in color for those that were asking. She's the Azure Dragon. But the big thing, the reason we keep calling her impetuous and kind of joking about that is that Yin-yin did something a little silly, which is that she launched an invasion because Yin-yin, unfortunately for her, got saddled with a good chunk of old lore about Cathay trying to invade the Southlands, and it didn't go well.
That was from Lizardman, as I recall, wasn't it?
Yes, the 5th edition Lizardman book.
5th edition army list.
Yeah, so really big story too. It's a lot of fun to read. But basically what happened is apparently Yin-yin seemingly like maybe she overheard, like she was either trying to expand Cathay's influence or maybe her father wanted her to do it or something. But Yin-yin launches an invasion of what she thinks is just the Southlands. But unfortunately for her, turns out there's another continent, because they knew the planet was a globe. They just didn't realize that there was another continent on the other side of the globe. So she leads an invasion of the Southlands, and her fleet that attacks the Southlands gets wiped out by a typhoon. Because the Slan had a plaque that told them, launch a typhoon on this date at this spot. And they went, okay. And Yin-Yin's fleet got obliterated. And then the other half of her fleet landed on the western shore of Lustria because they went all the way around, and they thought they landed on the Southlands and were like, all we have to do is march to the center of this continent and we'll meet up with the other half. And they got decimated, and a single survivor made it to the eastern shore and to one of the ports and made his way home to Great Cathay. And didn't go well. And she was deeply embarrassed. And her father was not happy. Shen Yang was not happy.
It's a fun one, isn't it? Because it's a nice way of using older lore to help characterize more current characters. And I think that it speaks to how older lore can be used and incorporated to ensure that the newer material still shines, but it does make her an unfortunate character in terms of the massive mistakes that are made there, because apparently it takes a century for her to rebuild her fleet. A century is an enormous amount of time, and it also suggests that the actual fleet that went off was equally enormous. So the shame that she must have felt, the embarrassment that she must have been subjected to, is not great for the poor character.
Yeah, and since then she's pretty much been forced to only deal with defending Great Cathay. She has not been allowed to lead an invasion since, which is actually why, because I've seen a lot of people ask about this, this is actually why Yuan Bo is the character that is invading Lustria in the new campaign, and he is trying to co-opt the geomantic web, because a lot of people are like, oh, shouldn't Yin-Yin do that, because that's kind of her thing? Yin-Yin screwed up. Yin-Yin tried, and she lost, so Dad's not trusting her with that important of a job. And absolutely. I do love how many people love Yin-Yin because of the fact that she is the underdog of the Dragon Kids, which is great. Like that adds a lot of fun flavor to her as a character. But yeah, so that's essentially Yin-Yin. She likely, in her view, has a lot to prove herself for. I suspect she's probably much closer to her mother than her father, which is why I suspect she wields a bow, because the Quay Yin loves the bow. Like, archery is one of Quay Yin's 3 major tenets, which are subterfuge, archery, and stealth or diplomacy. So one of the Dragon Kids needs to use a bow, and I think Yin-Yin, as someone that fights on ships, that would be perfect.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but
so have we done Zhao Ming when I was away?
No, I know. I was answering just like comments from chat. So
sorry for missing it all.
No, you're all good. You're all good. Zhao Ming, I love Zhao Ming. He is a fascinating dragon. So Zhao Ming is the Iron Dragon. He's the dragon of metal. He is a very skilled alchemist and smith. Which, if you're lore of metal, you got it. Those are your core tenets, are alchemy and smithing. So he is a grand forge master. He's able to create insane works of art and power, and do all sorts of cool stuff. And he is in charge of Shenyang, which is the ultimate city that's right on the border with the Warpstone Desert. And it's also where all the caravans show up. It is where everyone that comes all the way over from the west along the Ivory Road will end up and trade all of their goods. So it is a very, 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 very wealthy city, but it's kind of all that's out there in the western provinces, because the Warpstone Desert makes up the rest of it. But Zhao Ming's totally cool with that because he likes Warpstone. He loves Warpstone, because Warpstone, if you are an alchemist or a wizard or a smith, has insane properties. Like it's transmute, like especially if you're like into the whole alchemy business, especially, like, Warpstone is crazy important for transmuting substances and applying properties. And Zhao Ming has specialized himself into attempting to purify Warpstone and has been fairly successful. Like, he's managed to turn Warpstone into a reasonably stable material that can be used in weapons and armor without mutating or killing the bearers.
And we know that can be done from other species that have done similar things.
Yeah, the dwarves pulled it off a long time ago, but they lost it, unfortunately.
and the Skaven do, obviously, all the
Mm.
time. And they found a variety of methods of ensuring that Warpstone can be used, and I use this with a certain amount of hesitancy, safely. Obviously, it's the Warhammer World's equivalent of uranium et al. It's a highly radioactive but magical substance. So there are methods of controlling it and using it. And it's nice to see that they have taken an existing storyline that's popped up again and again throughout older, right up to present novels, where there are people who are experimenting with and trying to understand Warpstone. And when you put that through to its natural conclusion with an entity that can live for not just 100 to 200 years for the studying, but thousands, you're going to get someone who can not just effectively do it, but can also pass on that effectiveness to everyone around him. So it's a good development, I think, and a natural development for what would happen if you had creatures like the dragons existing in the Warhammer world.
Yeah,
Which
and
obviously you do.
Yeah, and Zhao Ming is a very interesting. He is considered his mother's favorite. It's not necessarily considered public knowledge, but apparently he's a mama's boy. That being said, he does have daddy problems. Zhao Ming very much wants his father's affection. He wants his father to be proud of him, but his father isn't, because Zhao Ming is very experimental, and he does a lot of things that, from the point of view of the other dragons, brings disharmony to Great Cataclysm. In that Zhao Ming actually is very much like his mother in that he cares about humans. He hangs out with humans. He is known to speak with his subjects. He goes and shares drinks with them. He goes down to like celebrate victories with them, spend time with them, get to know them. So his people love him. But the other dragons.
Also... Oh, sorry. Yeah,
no. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's also seen as potentially how Warpstone is beginning to corrupt him and turn him into something that's different from the other dragons, who all, even though ones who are seen to be the most affectionate, all have distance, where he doesn't.
Yeah, and Zhao Ming, like, he has this great relationship with his people, and it's very heavily implied because he works alongside them. Like, he's an alchemist and a smith. He runs what's known as the House of Secrets, and the House of Secrets are alchemists, and they are people who demonstrate a gift for Shaman, the Wind of Metal, and Zhao Ming invites them into Shenyang to work with him, to help him create things and understand further the properties of Warpstone. But so not only is he doing things from a cultural perspective very weird in that he's like hanging out with the rabble, with the peasantry, but he's also allowing essentially fugitives, these criminal wizards who are studying a lore of magic that is not sanctioned by Shenyang. They are not sanctioned by Yuan. They are full on illegal, and he is openly inviting them into his home. And there are notes that Yuan Bo and Zhao Ming do not get along.
I mean, is it any great surprise given that he is effectively standing as the rebel? He is the one who is not doing it the way that everybody else does it. He is the one that is doing his own thing and often ignoring edicts as they're getting passed down. He's like, yeah, sure, whatevs. You can worry about that nonsense. I've got stuff to do here. And to make it more complicated for those who would like to see him change arguably back to what he's supposed to be, he is exceedingly popular because of the nature of himself, and that makes it very difficult without literally dad coming down from on high and saying oi for any real change to be enacted. Sadly.
And when there's some interesting notes of Yuan Bo very much wants to rein in his brother. He wants to probably lead an army over to Shenyang and smack him around, but his mother tells him no. You leave my boy alone. He's fine. But there is a darker side to Zhao Ming, which is that his proximity to Warpstone likely is affecting him. Now, he's a dragon, so he's very durable and he's very resistant, but he's been there for a long time, and he works with this material a lot. And the other thing he's very close to is the Great Maw. And one of my most favorite things they introduced, and it's very exciting because of where it could go. I'm almost sad that, like, I really hope they explore it more in the old world, is that Zhao Ming has been started to be influenced by the Great Maw. He can hear it talking to him in his mind, which is crazy.
That's proper wrong.
We've never heard of a non-ogre having a relationship with the Great Maw. Like, he literally has a god that is borderline, like, it's not a chaos god, but it's not an order god. It's like a destruction god. It's just there.
Just a god. It's a god
Yeah.
of hunger. I mean, there's no need to necessarily tie it through to chaos or not. Although there is this deep desire amongst many writers to try and categorize everything, to make it a thing. Oh no, it must be a chaos god. All gods are chaos. There is no need for that. The Warhammer world is far more nuanced than that alone. Here, the Maw is very much the Maw, and it's fascinating that it has taken an interest as well in an external entity. And when you start trying to pick apart reasons, you could say that perhaps his hunger, his need to know what it is that he's pursuing,
knowledge,
his need for knowledge, his need to use Warpstone for something better. It's not just that it's drawing the Maw to him, it's also to a degree drawing him towards the Maw.
Yeah, and there's another really interesting element there is it could kind of explain a lot of his behavior changes. Not like, I think he's always been very empathetic and fond of humans, but he's almost kind of ogre-like in some of his personality, of that he's very boisterous and he has that sense of tribalism and camaraderie. And there's actually a hilarious note that Zhao Ming has a very good friend, and his very good friend is Greece's Goldtooth.
Because obviously.
Yeah, there is a hilarious transcript of a meeting between the two of them, because they meet often because they both control the Ivory Road. That's how Greece is as wealthy as he is. He controls the Ivory Road. And the two of them have had a fair number of meetings. And there's a note from Zhao Ming where he's apparently laughing at a comment that Greece's Goldtooth makes to him, where he says, I can see that you and I are very similar because we both desired our father's affection and did not receive it. But unlike you, I have yet to eat my father. And he makes a joke about how if he were to try, it would probably not be possible for him because his dad is so big. And Greases is like, not with that attitude.
Classic ogre perception. You could easily do that.
Leave my boy Zhao Greases. Big bone.
If you want to see a similar character that is entirely noble in terms of how they're portrayed, whose character has changed over time because of the influence of chaos, take a look over at Ariel with the Wood Elves, where she similarly has been using magics that are perhaps not the wisest. In her case, she's using dark magic as well as using high magic. And that dark magic has, over the course of time, wrought a change within her. And exactly the same here, where Warpstone has likely wrought a change within him. And that's taken a character who was one way and changed it over the course of time into a character who's perhaps a bit different. And that development is, I think, an essential component of ensuring that our Warhammer world doesn't become stale, because it often does and can. Hey. Oh, that would be a ship and a half.
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah.
Zhao Ming and his sugar daddy, yeah.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, like, and Zhao Ming is he's like very fond of ogres. There is a notable amount of ogres that live in Shenyang, obviously because of its the whole Ivory Road thing, when they often act as bodyguards for caravans, and they come to Shenyang, and Zhao Ming welcomes them with open arms, and he adores the ogres. Which is very interesting, especially when you consider that Shenyang hates them so much he tried to obliterate them. And now his son is fraternizing with them.
And I think that again speaks to change and speaks to how things have definitely moved on for him. But given where we are in the hour and the fact that it disappeared, we should probably move on to Li Dao, unless you did it when I wasn't around.
No. And Li Dao's actually quite quick because there's not a ton on him. There's some interesting. So Li Dao is the we're kind of sliding along an interesting scale of where, like, if Yin-yin is kind of the most yin of the dragons, you have Zhao Ming, who is technically he wields the lore of Yang, but he's the metal dragon. He is from the Yin Wind, and he has a lot of those Yin components. Yuan Bo is the balance dragon, and then we have Li Dao, who's all Yang. Li Dao is a fiery, angry, boisterous, pissed off dragon. He is by far the angriest of the five. And Li Dao also debatably has the least enviable job, which is that he defends the southern border. And the southern border of Cathay is a mess. There is a series of watchtowers, but it's very rural because every time they've tried to build up cities, they get attacked. So they often have to keep cities kind of smaller and more separated because they're constantly under threat. And Li Dao is also in charge of the Mountains of Heaven, which we'll get into in a second. But like from the south, he's constantly dealing with the Naga of Koresh, who are not nice. They are a very, very spooky race. While we don't have a ton of details on them, the Naga of Koresh are often called the Blood Naga, and they are said to hunt men like animals beneath the moonlight of the jungles, and they are very spooky, and they use a lot of powerful magic, and everybody's scared of them. So he has to deal with them. He also holds off the Kingdoms of End. While the Kingdoms of End does have a little bit of an embassy, the village of the Tigermen, within the borders of Grand Cathay, their relationship is not always good. And war often breaks out between those nations, especially because End is said to be a nation that reveres gods. It's the land of 1,000 gods, and they probably have a lot more than 1,000. Like gods are very important to End, whereas Cathay is borderline atheistic. There's a lot of potential conflict there, because gods don't tend to look very nice on people who talk shit about them. And then in the midst of that is the Monkey King. And the Monkey King, just like the Monkey King from our world, funny enough, in Warhammer, they haven't named him yet, though if they don't call him Sun Wukong, I'll be amazed, because in every other fantasy adaptation, the Monkey King is literally like public use. Everybody uses the Monkey King, and he's always called Sun Wukong. But in any event, the Monkey King is immensely powerful. He is crazy levels of powerful. And the Mountains of Heaven are his domain. It said it's apparently the biggest mountain range in the world. It just is. It's like, even though all the mountain ranges are terrifyingly huge in Warhammer, the Mountains of Heaven are said to be like the big ones. And the Monkey King is a bit of a neutral party. Sometimes he fights with Cathay. Sometimes he fights alongside Cathay. Sometimes he, like, whose side he's on it depends. The Monkey King has worked with the Skaven. He's worked with the Kingdoms of End. But he seems more often than not to fight alongside Grand Cathay. But him and Li Dao have an unfriendly relationship. They are apparently what you could probably call frenemies. Or though it's probably more likely that the Monkey King likes pissing off Li Dao, because the Monkey King is very similar to our world's mythological Monkey King in that he is a trickster, and he's also notorious for just pissing people off for the fun of it. He's a little prankster, and he loves pissing the dragons off for the fun of it. There's a note by Yuan Bo in the short story that the only entity that can actually get Yuan Bo so angry that he loses his shit is the Monkey King, which is hilarious. Because the Monkey King is apparently very inventive with his insults. But Li Dao hates him a lot of the time, it's implied, but he has to deal with him. And Li Dao, being the fire dragon, actually is very much in his blood, and he is angry all the time. And he's fighting all the time. And he's very resentful of his siblings, because Li Dao sees it that all of his siblings got very cushy jobs, or very respectful jobs, very honorable jobs, and he's stuck fighting an endless war protecting the rest of his sibling stuff, and they don't appreciate how hard his job is. They don't appreciate
particularly as well because he doesn't catch any of the glory that you'd get from defending against the great hordes of chaos to the north, which is left to his sister. So he's left dealing with all the quite irritable scraps to the south that comes hand in hand with a lot of hard, busy work, but without any real great glory. So he's left, if anything, even more angry by the end of it, seeing that others are getting to do their thing, and he feels that his thing is forging forward and burning the fuckers. And what's he left with? The real war, the war he wants to do, up there. Yes, and it does seem like the Blood God would appeal to him.
Yeah, I would not be shocked
for the fact it's a god and fuck the gods, see the dragons.
Yeah, it would not surprise me at all if there are Cornet cults, a lot of them in the South, because of just the endless fighting. That tends to be very up Corn's alley. Because, like, when you're surrounded by it, like, you know, turn to somebody that's going to help you, even though it's going to be a bad thing in the end. Hammond, I promise we will get to Shinzu in a minute. And no, they're not bear dragons, at least none that we're aware of. God, I hope there's not bear dragons. So anyway, that's essentially Li Dao. That's pretty much all we know about him. He's very resentful of his siblings. He's very angry. And he is fighting an endless war. That's really all there is to say. Though his fire is said to be pretty intense. There's actually a note in the Kugoth story about him with the dragons that Kugoth Plaguefather ended up fighting Yuan Bo, Zhao Ming, and Li Dao at the same time, along with another great unclean one, and that Kugoth was actually trying to kill, hilariously enough. And Li Dao incinerated both of them when he finally got into position, because he hits like a truck. So beyond that, the last dragon child that we haven't covered yet is Miao Ying. Who
we sort of covered her to a degree.
It's a small bit, but she defends the Great Bastion. She has the most honorable job, and she is considered the most favored by her father. Her father loves her, and he gives her a job he would, in many ways, not like debatably not even trust Yuan Bo with, because it's a job that requires an iron fist of like, you know, if you watch the Cathay reveal trailer, her whole thing about, you know, demand sacrifice. You know, we must do whatever it takes to defend the Great Bastion. It doesn't matter how many lives it costs, how much money it costs, all this stuff. All that matters is that the Great Bastion stands strong. And it is an incredibly critical job to the survival of Grand Cathay. And the other thing about her is that she's actually a very interesting. The thing I really like about Miao Ying is she's a very interesting interpretation of the lore of life, which is often kind of seen as a very hippie or lovey-dovey, like, oh, I love all things that are living and embracing things. But she is cold Mother Nature. Mother Nature, in that cruel, distant sense of unleashing, you know, storms on you, and you know, she does not care. She has a goal to accomplish.
Yep.
And she is in a sense propagating life, but she does not. She values the grand total, not the individual pinpricks.
She's all business.
Yeah, and she is by far the coldest. Like, she doesn't seem to. I think in some ways she kind of I think she takes a lot of pride in her job, but she probably also finds it very exhausting. Though there are some fun notes about her. She worked with the city of Nangao, which is where all like the greatest master artificers are, where they create all like the war machines and a lot of the guns.
Lighting the Bastion.
Yeah, a lot of where the black powder is manufactured and stuff. And what's hilarious is that the lords of Nangao actually are very scared of Miao Ying. It is not like the relationship between Zhao Ming and Shen Yang, where the lords of Nangao actually resent Miao Ying because they kind of want to do their own thing, and sometimes she will leave them to their own devices, but she will often come down on top of them to make sure they're behaving themselves, and they are terrified of her. They would very much, like, they think they're very important and awesome and should be, they're like, oh, we're the reason the Great Bastion is still there. It's our guns that are protecting it. We should be more important. We should be more powerful, more politically powerful. Miao Ying keeps them in check, which has a very interesting relationship, where Miao Ying probably has the least good relationship with humans of all the dragon kids.
Yep, I think that's fair.
Yep. And then the last dragon child that we know about is Shenzu, and we know very little about her. All we know is that Shenzu is the light dragon, and that she brought hope to Grand Cathay. She almost seemed to be more of like a mascot, and she's the youngest from what we can tell. She's either the absolute youngest or the second youngest next to Zhao Ming, but I suspect she is the absolute youngest. And Shenzu, being the light dragon, is said to have brought a lot of balance, because she kind of was, it seemed to Grand Cathay, she was the antithesis to chaos in general. She burned away the corruption. She burned away that bad kind of darkness. But she vanishes, and no one's really sure why. Something happened, and Shenzu left without telling anyone. She turned into her dragon form, and she went into the north. And the last person that saw her was Urson, which plays into the story campaign of Total War Warhammer 3. And Shenzu goes north, and she goes far north, seemingly to the realm of chaos itself. Mm-hmm. Why? We don't know. And that's an awesome mystery. It's an awesome mystery. Presumably she went there for a purpose. And as the light dragon, she has a lot of power. She might not necessarily understand her power very well. And but I suspect her understanding of the world is very different from everyone else's, because the lore of light is it's the lore of truth. It's a lore of understanding. So there are probably things that she understands that no one else does.
Yep.
And then,
and for the record, I don't think that she's the dragon that Archeon kills. Just saying. The dragon that Archeon kills is almost described as a relatively classic fire-breathing, chaos-affected dragon. And I do not think that it's likely to be her. She's just too cool in terms of where she sits in both the terms of the dragon family itself and the winds of magic that she's most influenced by, to be so easily torn apart by that. And it speaks to one of my biggest issues that, for example, the End Times material had, where it focused entirely upon just tiny little pockets of the world and tried to pretend that was the entire world. Where creatures like, for example, this dragon would have been a marvelous reveal at some point, even if the studio had just gone, we've got other parts of the world, why don't we just drop some of those bits in rather than saying, and then Grimgor killed everyone.
Yeah. Jesus. Yeah. Hammond, thank you. No. For the last time. That was Lilith for the last time. But in any event, so Shinzu vanished into the north. I'm very, very curious how the old world's going to handle Shinzu, because technically she only just vanished. So I'm curious if they're going to talk about her being in Grand Cathay, because it'd be very interesting if she is not entrusted with a grand province. Why? Like, do mom and dad, like, is she the little, is she the baby? Do they like to keep her close to home? Or because she's the light dragon, does she represent something that they're like, no, we don't want you in charge of provinces. We don't want you out there. We need you here. We need you in Weijin for some reason. And then she sneaks away. Because there's a lot of
possibly she's got a secret mission from mom.
Yeah. Could be mom or dad sent her away. Yeah, as part of the plan. So that's Shinzu. And then the last two dragons who we don't know their names. There's the Shadow Dragon, who we know nothing about, which is very fitting for a Shadow Dragon. I have a huge fan theory that the Shadow Dragon fled. That the Shadow Dragon, being a dragon of justice, or that might have be very closely associated with justice, and being able to not only conjure illusions but see through them, might have realized that the harmony of Grand Cathay is not what it appears to be. And he or she may have also seen what their parents were up to and not agreed with it. Figured out what Shinzu and Quay were up to and said, nope, I'm not going to be a part of this, and fled. And I think the Shadow Dragon went to Nippon.
I think that's not a bad idea. I think it's also worth stating that for all it's very easy to see Cathay as this great overarching pillar of awesomeness that does everything better than everybody else. Ultimately, it is going to fail massively. The end of the world is coming and it's going to fail. And to say that no one is expecting this and to say that there will be no characters that try to do something about that, I think is a failure. So having characters like, for example, unnamed Shadow Dragon that tears off and attempts to resolve things in a different way, I think is well worth it. Shenzu pulled a grim there. Yeah.
Galileo, I would counter that's what literally Shen Yang and Quay Yin are. Like, they are the dragons of Yin and Yang. So it would be weird to have it repeat the children. And then the last dragon child, who we don't know what their concept is. Like, are they associated with like a wind we don't know about? Are they a combination of all the winds? Are they a negation of all the winds? Personally, my personal theory, I'd be curious to hear if Andy has one, but my personal theory is that they are a combination of all 8 winds. And I believe this dragon was the one that fell to chaos and became what we know as Flame Fang, who went off and fought Archaon.
So that would be my general belief as well, because we are aware that there is another dragon, which I can't recall the name of. It's like Yin Ya.
Flame Fang is its Western name.
I don't have it. Flame Fang. Let's call it Flame Fang.
Yeah, it has a Eastern name.
Yes, it does have an Eastern name. It's quite an old one. I can't remember where it came from originally. It's Yin Ya Long. Yin Yalo. Well, of course it is. Because I totally remembered that.
I probably butchered the pronunciation, but I'll post it in the chat.
It's good enough. I'm pretty convinced that if that isn't tied together, then someone's not quite doing their job right, because it's easy to do. It makes sense. You can create a tragic story for how this particular dragon fell. And that is, I think, a great story yet to be told.
Yeah, I really hope they go with that, because it'd be an awesome tragedy. Because supposedly, I'll call him Yin Long just to make my life easier, or Flame Fang just to make life easy. Flame Fang supposedly laid waste to a lot of Cathay, like did a lot of damage before it fled to the west, which would be a heartbreaking story. And also, supposedly it devoured the Eye of Shirian, which could be.
I seem to recall it was full of babies as well.
Well, so
didn't Archeon get swallowed by it and end up killing a whole bunch of dragon babies inside it? That's a long time ago. I read that.
There was a weird thing in the Archeon book of like it was also like made of people because it was resurrected. Like Flame Fang was resurrected.
All the flesh had slewed. Oh yeah, that's
yeah.
I remember.
It was weird.
It was proper crazy.
Yeah, but Flame Fang would be. Flame Fang is Horus. But there are a not insignificant amount of parallels between the Primarchs and the Dragon Children. It's a little on the nose sometimes, but
a little.
Though I do think they are much better interpretations, because there's a lot more dynamics to them, which I like. Also, there's not fucking 18 of them. Jesus Christ, or 20 with 2 missing. Anyway, so we don't know anything about the undivided dragon either. I personally think it's Flame Fang. I would love a story of like, they go after the Eye of Shirian thinking maybe they could use it to help Cathay, and then they get it and it corrupts them and they become a Zinchian dragon. Then there's a big war and all sorts of other stuff.
We have a massive Chaos Assault, so presumably an Everchosen making its way into Cathay around about, this is again off the top of my head, around about 1300, 1400. Earthquakes flash through, take down the Bastion in several key places, and a massive Chaos Assault comes through, presumably with an Everchosen. So you've got perfect opportunities for horrible Chaos artifacts to be dropped, studied, cause something to fall, and eventually turn into what allows Archeon to become the next Everchosen a couple of Everchosens later.
Yes, 1310, when Lord Quex decided I'm gonna ruin all the empires in the world at once. And he broke the Dwarf Empire and Cathay in the same day. Oh, Lord Quex the bastard. But in any event, so yes, that is all the Dragon Kids. A couple of their interesting notes about them before we get into their descendants is that I've seen a couple people ask, what are the Emperor and Empress up to? The real answer is we don't know. There is an interesting period known as like the Age of Darkness, which is that for about 100 to 200 years, the both parents vanish without explanation. Shen Yang and Quay Yin, they're totally gone, and their kids have no idea where they went. So a little bit of panic sets in, and the kids start fighting among themselves, because without mom and dad to like order them around, they start Age of Darkness and Disharmony. Thank you. So they start having disagreements, they start fighting each other, wars break out. And it gets worse and worse. And then the Monkey King shows up, and the Monkey King invades because apparently some Skaven of Clan Eshin came up to the Monkey King and were like, hey, did you know the Dragon Emperor and them are gone? You should be Emperor. And the Monkey King went, I like the sound of that. The Monkey Emperor. Ooh. Because of course he got talked into that by the Skaven. I love that. It's such a funny thing. So the Monkey King invades Grand Cathay with his monkey warriors with the help of Clan Eshin. And he actually successfully invades all the way up to Wei-Jin, and he takes Wei-Jin insanely. And he sits upon the throne of the Celestial Dragon Emperor and declares himself Emperor. And as a reward for their assistance, he declares a Skaven warlord, Kishkik of Clan Eshin, to be his Grand Vizier, his advisor. And at this point, the Cathayan Dragon Children lose their shit. They cannot, A, the Monkey King sitting on Dad's throne, B, there are fucking Skaven in Dad's house. that is too far. So the Dragon Kids set aside their differences finally, and they unite in a big fight against the Monkey King. And what's crazy is he actually holds them off. With the help of the Skaven, the Monkey King is actually able to fight all 5 of them. And then miraculously, Mom and Dad come home. And Shen Yang and Quay, very interestingly, after this kind of 100-year period, they just show up. They just appear. And they join the fighting. And with them back, the Monkey King realizes he's totally fucked. So the Monkey King runs away. He flees with his tail between his legs, and he runs back to the mountains of heaven, and the Skaven get absolutely wiped. And but a lot of bad things happen because of this, where like a lot of Tzeentchian cults really get their grips in a lot of parts of Cathay during all the chaos that's going on. A lot of other forces, nefarious forces, manage to slip in, and it's just a whole mess. And where the parents went, they never say. They do not tell their children where they went, but apparently they found something. They discovered some secret, because that's when Shen Yang kicks his plan into overdrive. And he returned in roughly somewhere around circa 2400 of the imperial calendar, which is about 100 years-ish before the modern day. So all of that has been building up to what's happening now. Yeah, the end times, where presumably he is throwing his own hat into the gambit to try and pull something off.
Yep.
So, yeah, fun. And then the last thing, which is arguably the most fascinating thing, are the Shugegan guns.
Utterly.
So the Shugegan guns are the direct descendants of the dragons, but they are humans. They are not dragons. Because what happened is that the Dragon Children, being not technically full-blooded dragons, they are half dragon, half whatever the hell Quay is.
Half mom.
Yeah, half mom. Yeah, half moon person. Where Quay was in the form of a dragon when she conceived and gave birth to them, but they inherited some of her power, and she also taught them the arts of how to use the lore of Yin to transform themselves into a human form. And what's fascinating is that the lore of Yin, because it's not just Ulgu, it's more profound than that. It's not an illusion. They're not hiding in the guise of a human in the sense that they're really a dragon, but they just look like a human. They are genuinely turning themselves into a human.
Yeah, I think an easy way to try and imagine this is if you try and step out of all of their individual mythologies and just look at them for what they are the children of a shapeshifter, and they themselves inherently have the shapeshifting ability inside them, and that allows them to, with the correct preparations, just shift into a human form. And that apparently comes hand in hand with a certain degree of interest in the human form.
Yeah, so apparently the Dragon Children, and it's kind of implied that the idea comes from their parents of that y'all should have children with the humans. And for most of the Dragon Children, it is not out of love. It is not out of passion. It is a duty. It is part of their role. It is a job they must perform. They, to put it bluntly, they get busy fucking a lot of people because they have a ton of descendants.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's really interesting. This is out of all the lore that has been added, this is by far the one that interests me most. Because if I was coming at this as a writer, the amount of additional emotion that this adds to what is otherwise quite a bland set of heroes being heroes. This is proper relationship stuff. Sometimes there are going to be ones who are cold. There's going to be others that can't be cold. So the coldest person always falls in love. That's part of the cool stories that you can tell. And the fact that they have been going for thousands of years and have watched their lovers live and die and live and die. For some, that will be heart-wrenching. For others, it will, if anything, make them more distant until eventually they meet another one that just touches them in a way that one did maybe thousands of years before. And that, I think, is an aspect to their characters that's never really going to properly come out in something like a war game. but most certainly can come out when the novels or comics or
God,
possibly the
please, Black
role-playing
Library.
game.
Please.
When the role-playing, totally.
Yeah,
when
the role-playing
game starts doing its in-depth examination in this, you're going to end up with a whole host of characters that were the children of and will be treated by some as the children of. That's going to give them an exceedingly important position in the Celestial Court or wherever else it is that they happen to be. They are going to be the granddaughters, the grandchildren of the Emperor directly. And that is extraordinarily fascinating. But it's not just that. There's going to be some who are carrying that blood and they're interweaving. Some of them are going to be great granddaughters. The blood is now out there. The blood of the dragons is in the people of Cathay. And that brings about difference. And that's fascinating. So you not only have these sort of interesting characters who are carrying interesting powers within them, you also have a host of super unexamined, fascinating, wonderful characters who are children of literal fucking dragons. This is extraordinary, and it's something that the game.
Please roleplay game. Really... Yes, I want to play a Shugegan.
This is going to be going up and saying, my honored mother, and actually speaking to them. My father. This is the person. What are they? How long do they live? Do they live for a very long time? Are some of them also ancient? There's going to be some really fascinating characters built out of this. And it's a part of the overall Cathayan world that's yet to be really expanded. And it's, of all the things that it's added, the one that makes me go, ooh, I'd do this with that, and that with that, and that with that. And ooh, it's very exciting.
Yeah, Song of Power. Thank you for the goofy joke. Though I suspect that there's a hilarious note. Quay does not seem to mind the Monkey King nearly as much as Shen Yang does. Shen Yang fucking hates him. To the point that Shen Yang literally has propaganda being put out in Cathay to try and convince the people of Cathay that the Monkey King is a chaos creature, where the different provinces of Cathay think the Monkey King is a different type of creature. And depending on the province, they think he's associated with a different god. So like in the South, he's believed to be like a giant red gorilla that tears people apart limb from limb and drinks their blood. Whereas like in the East, he's supposed to be a bloated green orangutan that's covered in disease and filth. And he's very nurgly. And then in like the West, he's supposed to be a small spider monkey that's bluish and he whispers in people's ears and he convinces people to go mad and to be duplicitous and, very Zinchian. And in the North, he's known as like a baboon with a big bare ass that just has a huge harem and he's screwing everything in sight, and he causes indulgence to follow wherever he goes, and none of that's true. That's not what the Monkey King's like at all. He's not any of those things. It's just Shen Yang spreading propaganda to try and make the people of Cathay hate the Monkey King and turn that culture against them, which is very, very interesting. But anyway, going back to what Andy was talking about, so a couple of cool things we do know about the Shugegans is that the Shugegans are very, very, they're not all magically gifted, is a fun fact. A lot of people see the Shugegan Lord in Warhammer and go, oh, that's it. There's actually significantly more Dragon Children than that. The Shugegan Lord that you see in game are just those that demonstrate a very apt gift for magic. And when they showcase that they have capable magic abilities, they are taught high magic. And then once they learn high magic, based either on their parentage or maybe their personality or something, they are shunted to learn yin or yang. And then they specialize in that lore. But you have to learn high magic before you can learn yin or yang. You have to master all the winds, then you can learn yin or yang, which is very interesting.
Which does also speak to their potential age as well.
Yeah, they are old. Most of these Shugegan lords, especially the wizard ones you see, they live much longer than humans do.
Yeah.
Easily. They're
basically another species.
Yeah, some of them have been around for like easy centuries. They're not as long lived as the Dragon Children because they're not. They have full on human genes in them, so they will die eventually of old age. But they are much longer lived than regular humans. They're probably somewhere between dwarf and elf as far as like lifespan goes.
Does seem to be about correct. I mean, if they're learning high magic is a significant expenditure of time because you need to master all 8 winds.
Appreciate that, Lion.
And then
Thank you,
move on
sir.
to high. Yeah, thanks very much.
That's very sweet. Thank you.
but yeah, it's a big thing. So yeah, you're probably talking centuries.
But like Andy was saying, one of the fun things is that it's very likely that the Shugegans are probably closer to like very recent generations. So like their mother had relations with one of the dragons, or their grandmother or their grandfather. Whereas it's likely the further down they are, the more diluted their blood becomes. The more human blood they have, the less dragon blood they have. They likely are not as magically gifted, and this is where we get all of the other dragon-blooded children. So like in the new Shadows of Change DLC, the Celestial Generals are dragon-blooded. But they don't have magical ability, but they are significantly stronger than humans. They're far more gifted in combat because they probably still live longer. Maybe they only live for 2 or 3 centuries as opposed to maybe like 1,000 years, but they don't age like humans do. And they're able to practice martial combat to a ridiculous degree, an elven degree of really mastering combat styles. And it's likely they're probably stronger and faster than regular men.
Yeah. I'd also add that if you have someone like, say, Miao Ying sitting at the top of a particular social structure, which she does, the chances of there not being some form of breeding program where you're actually getting dragon-blooded breeding with dragon-blooded, which means that the blood potency does not necessarily thin. So that's also going to be a certain amount of other types of dragon-blooded characters who are maybe relatively closely related, but almost certainly carrying blood of significant power. Because if you're looking to build a military force, you're going to be looking to propagate these. You're going to want more of them.
Yeah, and there are some interesting notes in the Cathayan lore that Miao Ying and Yuan Bo take a very, shall we say, calculating approach to their children.
Totally.
They are often said to not particularly be, not that they're not fond of them, but they are not emotionally attached to many of their partners and their children. They might have had rare exceptions. Some stories exploring that would be fun, or maybe just over time, they're like, it's not worth it. They don't live long enough. Like eventually they're going to die. So why get attached? But like Miao Ying and Yuan Bo in particular are very calculating about, I need this many children. Oh, some of my children, like Miao Ying has sent her children like to defend the Great Bastion and stuff. She's very detached from them, which is why she's known as cold and aloof. She does not treat with her children like Zhao Ming does. Zhao Ming is very close to many of his partners and his children, which is another thing the dragons are kind of like, what are you doing with him about? Like, he actually seems to care for a lot of his descendants. Whereas like Miao Ying, there are some notes in the lore for the Cathayan book and some of the loading screens and stuff that like treating with her is stressful for a dragon-blooded, because all she cares about are your accomplishments, and you are a tool to be used in order to perform her role. Yuan Bo is very similar. There are notes from there's some actually really cool loading screen quotes about him from the perspective of his children, from his descendants, and they see him as their boss. They see him as someone they revere, not someone that they love. Not in a sense of, they very much agree with their father and they understand him, but they see him from the perspective that Yuan Bo does. Yuan Bo literally has a quote where he says, like, humanity, the purpose of humanity is that they desire control, to be controlled. That is a literal quote from Yuan Bo. Like, he does not think very highly of humanity.
Looking at
which one of the fun things though to explore with them is that each dragon child probably has a very distinct relationship with humans. How do they feel about humans? How do they mate with them? How do they treat their descendants? Do they like welcome them to come see them? And do they train them? Do they spend time with them? I almost feel like Miao Ying's probably the kind that has like a number, like assigns numbers to them as opposed to names. I'm sure she knows all of their names, but to her, they're calculations, they're resources to be spent. Whereas Zhao Ming is probably like, yeah, I show up to their birthdays. Yeah, I send them presents when they get married. I show up, like, I'm involved in my kids' lives. Which is very interesting. And that's a large part of, and like the dragon-blooded are everywhere. When you're playing with Grand Cathay, the LAWhammer riders are all dragon-blooded. To ride a LAWhammer, which are sometimes known as Spirit Qian as well, you have to be dragon blooded. They will not allow you to ride them unless you have dragon blood in your veins. Because there's some sort of relationship that's established there, like a pact. A regular human would not have any business trying to get on one of those dragon horses. They will kill you. Which is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And so most, not all, but most of the Celestial Dragon Guard are also dragon blooded. They are probably the most diluted, bloodline wise, because they're essentially just glorified bodyguards. They're an elite rank, but they're not able to ride the Longma. And while they're skilled warriors, there are also regular humans that, if they prove themselves well enough, can also ascend to the rank of Celestial Dragon Guard.
Yep.
Wasn't where the Habsburg dynasty were Cathayan.
The good old chins.
Yeah. Any thoughts on the implications of dragon-blooded people running around for vampires in Cathay? Yeah, that's a great question, I think, for Andy. So there's a whole thing of like Aberash and the whole dragon blood thing, along with Zacharias the Ever-Living, where dragon blood, if it's like high enough quality and quantity, seems to cure the vampire curse and also make the vampire super duper strong. Where Zacharias and Aberash are like scary powerful compared to most other vampires. But how do you,
assuming that I'm not stuttering? Oops.
We can hear you just fine.
At my side because you're stuttering for me.
Only visually. We can hear you just fine.
Oh, okay, cool. I apologize for doing the robot.
It's all you're good.
I am running through a mobile. So I think, broadly speaking, given the way that Cathay has changed from when most of the material was written for the undead, and it has changed significantly, it's going to have deep and abiding effects in terms of the butting of the two different types of lore and exactly where they sit. I think it is very fair to say that the entirety of Grand Cathay would be not just against what the vampires represent, they would be pushing hard to eliminate them. Largely because what the vampires represent is small, not vampires, probably the Cathayan dragon-blooded folk represent is almost gold doubloons in terms of how awesome they are for the vampires, which means the vampires themselves are going to be very interested in getting hold of this pure essence, this vitae, this life that they can take from these dragon-blooded folk, which means in turn they will clamp down hard. Really hard. It wouldn't surprise me if there's unique versions of vampires over there, but equally, it wouldn't surprise me if they're almost entirely eradicated or pushed out. One of the great obvious developments that they've done with Grand Cathay is showing how they're one large society that's trying to work together in harmony, and anything that's disharmonious, anything that lies outside the plan as it exists there is going to be pushed to the periphery. So the cultists are going to find it more difficult to move in. Everyone is working presumably together. The dragons are at the top and they are largely uncorruptible. So you don't have the same issues that the rest of the Warhammer world species confront, except for arguably the lizardmen. And that is corruption rampant throughout everything. Meaning that it is going to be very easy to identify those who are standing outside the norm. So, cut a long story short, it's going to be a hard life being a vampire over there.
Yeah, and I suspect the jade-blooded vampires would be, which we know are still canon, which is very nice. The descendants of Herakte, I think.
I can't remember the name. That's why I didn't mention it.
I think it's Herakte. But they are probably very underground. But I suspect there will probably be some very cool lore bits about them trying to abduct dragon children, experimenting on them, draining them. And this also adds some really interesting potential for Vashanesh, because it said that Vashanesh wandered the world for a very long time and went to Cathay for a little while. Maybe he got a little dragon blood himself. Could explain why he was so goddamn scary and strong.
Manfred did the same later.
Yeah, Manfred. Yeah. So there's a lot of really cool things that could happen
Although
with
you
those
could argue
interactions.
that Manfred made significantly less ingress there, given that it's not inside his book Liber Necris, because inevitably, if it was, then he would have made it and it would have been in the book. So
well, knowing Manfred,
he wasn't quite as successful.
Yeah, though I do love Manfred has this. We'll have to do a thing on him sometime, but he has a really fun
Manfred's
thing where
great.
he's like
We need
he's
to do a
literally gone
Manfred
around.
stream.
He's literally gone around and chatted with all of the different bloodlines, which is such a cool
Yep.
element for him. Is there any relationships between Nippon and Cathay? Yes, there are. Sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're enemies. It just depends.
Yeah.
It's complicated. But yeah, so yes, that's the Dragon Children. I also saw a comment I really wanted to pull up because I thought it was super interesting, which is this: are there dragon blood descendants of the lost dragons still around? That's a great question.
And I think that the answer is probably yes for some and no for others. And I think that is an aspect of the setting that's yet to be plumbed. If, for example, I got employed to write a book for Grand Cathay, that would be top of my list for interesting new NPCs to add to the already interesting setting. I would be taking one of the cities and I would have somebody there that nobody would expect. Someone who perhaps manifests something that is quite different to what has been manifested everywhere else. You'd need to make sure that you spent enough time detailing what everybody expects for Grand Cathay, but also one of the great strengths of role-playing games is that you can plumb into a whole bunch of extra details that you don't have time for when you're doing a war game. So yeah, I definitely think that at least one or two of those, it's not just that they could be around, they should be around.
Yeah,
because it makes it more fun.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways to explore that, of like if you're dealing with someone like Shiyama, where she's been gone for thousands of years, like at what point do the dragon-blooded stop exhibiting dragon-blooded symptoms? And like Andy said, what if you're something like many times great descendant and you just happen to exhibit more than your ancestors did, and everyone's like, what the hell? Who are you related to? Because like I'm sure they keep meticulous records about like who's descended from who, unless one of those dragons was lost.
And I think that makes some really interesting points for Cathayan society, where in Cathayan society, it's quite possible that in the Empire, for example, people show signs of magic. They show signs of divinity in that the gods select them, sometimes as children, and they're picked out and they're somehow seen as gaining revelation from the gods. In Cathayan society, they have something completely different. Anybody might be carrying the blood of dragons. Any of them might be. Now, the primary ones are tracked, but some of them from thousands of years ago could be carrying that gene, and that gene just pops up.
Humans are going to be humans. There are going to be some dragon-blooded bastards running around.
For example, amongst a rebel village or something similar, and in comes the dragon to stop it, and then they see someone who looks identical to their lost sister or brother. That would just be amazing.
Yeah, or even like a dragon-blooded that's traveled and ends up having children in the Empire or Bretonia or something. Like, ooh.
There's all manner of really cool character types you can pull from that.
Yeah, Maladel, yeah, that's another really cool idea. Like, there could be cults or groups that are obsessed with trying to like, oh, we have to keep Shiyama's blood alive. We have to keep it. We have to like, which could lead to all sorts of problems.
That'd be a super cool cult to make as well. That's perhaps sitting up by the river.
Yeah,
and attempting to try and gain access through to the
we know there's a cult of like, I think they're called the ancestral monks, or they're like the ancestral monks of Shyish or something like that, who tend to the river and they tend to the court of Shyish that supposedly lies at the bottom.
And I think it'd be super cool if you had one or two of them kicking around, possibly carrying her blood.
Yeah,
awesome.
And there's other fun, like, kind of angst things. Like, if you have a dragon that's disappeared more recently, like Shinzu, how do her children handle that? Like, their progenitor is gone. Oh my God, what does that mean for us? What's our station now? We can't talk to mom anymore. What do we do?
I love that.
Yeah, so that's super duper cool. And then the last thing that I think is really worth talking about with the Dragon Kids, I think, is turning back a moment to Shiyama of the underworld, because it's just such a fascinating thing of that. Cathay is the only race I know of that their underworld has a physical presence on the planet. Like, there is a place you can go where the dead are, and they are gathered to, and they don't seem to perform like the other dead. They hang on to all their memories. They don't seem to be preyed upon by demons, and they can be summoned back to the land of the living, and they show up as warriors to fight. I
imagine when details added to that, it will gain some additional parameters. I'm not saying changes, but definitely parameters.
Yeah, and
because
it's
the
what's
Warhammer world has
interesting
got
is
a
there's apparently a court. Like Shiyama presides over some sort of realm that is down there where people live, but it's like, what goes on there?
Yeah.
Is it a good place? Is it a bad place? Like, what's going on down there?
There's 10 courts, isn't there?
Yes,
10
the
courts
10 courts of Shaish.
Yeah.
In the depths of the Dragon River. Yep.
Yeah,
and like living
that to me is just awesome. That's something I'd want to dive into and very much elaborate upon, write about, detail. It just sounds exciting.
Yeah, and it's like, and there are some forces that would love to mess with that. Like demons would want to get in on that. The vampires or necromancers would be like, oh man, if we could tap into this, look at all these spirits we could call upon. And like, how does necromancy work in Cathay? Because the spirits of the dead are drawn to this specific place. Like, is there a unique interaction with necromancy? Like,
well, necromancy at its very heart is about not just spirits; it's about animating corpses.
Oh yeah, well, like the corpses, I'm sure are fine, but like, I wonder if like if it's more rare to see spirits, like are Karen race or Hex race more rare? Well, Hex race aren't normal spirits, but anyway, like are banshees like not really a thing in Cathay?
Really, they have their own equivalents.
Yeah.
There'll be those who, for example, for one reason or another, couldn't find their way to where they should be going. Lost spirits. Other ones manifesting in places they shouldn't be, in certain rituals that need to be enacted.
Yeah, that's called an apocalyptic scenario, is what that is.
It is, and it's a shame that we don't know what would occur from that, because it's exactly the sort of thing that you'd want to see in an end time scenario.
Face Octopus, that's such an awesome technical question. Well, granted, once again, she does not seem to take the form of what she turns into. She legitimately turns into what she turns into. So yeah, it would probably work. If it works on Cathay and Dragons, which I assume it does, because it works on like the weird Nagaroth sea dragon things. So I guess it's, I don't know, that Karagul seems to have some kind of
You gotta remember, she's not a dragon.
Yeah, but like when she turns into a dragon, she is a dragon, kind of like
yeah.
I don't know.
Sure.
But yeah. So fascinating stuff. Honestly, fascinating stuff. I am really happy with how the Dragon Children have turned out so far.
Yeah, I love them. For me, they're a relatively new addition. Obviously, they are in general, but for me, because I haven't played the game, they're not something that I've been aware of all the way through. I first became aware of them as a concept just before the game released, because Andy Hall came on with us with the Rookery, and he did an episode the night before the game was released. That was super fun. It's out there somewhere. If you want to go see how excited Andy was for his game to be releasing the next day, it's over there on Rookery Publications website, a YouTube one. And that was super fun. And I first became aware of it because everyone wants to know exactly how the Dragon Kids were born. And ever since then, I've dabbled lightly. And the more I've read, the more excited I've got by them. And now that I'm, for my own personal games, working on a version of Nippon as well, it's done nothing more than really take away the constraints that many of the lore building for Warhammer sort of shackle you with, given that their Grand Cathay is so very different to any of the other setting materials that have been built for the Warhammer world. It's almost a new setting entirely, and it even takes established parts of the Warhammer world that do work definitively one way or another, like, for example, the Winds of Magic. And they've gone, no, culturally, they will be seen through these sort of eyes, which means that these are going to be perceived in an entirely different way, and they're also going to be used in a different way. And for someone who has been, to a degree, constrained by Games Workshop's very precise definitions of how these individual systems worked, it was a revelation where you could go, well, if they can do that there, then there is absolutely no reason why that can't happen here, even as close as, say, Tilia, when Tilia gets re-examined. Perhaps it'll have its entirely own unique view on how exactly magic works. A unique view that perhaps hasn't been strongly imported and placed upon them by the elves, which is what happened in the Empire approximately 200 years ago, where all of their magical knowledge got replaced by elven magical knowledge, and that is the Winds of Magic as we understand it today. So for me, I adore it all, almost unreservedly. I'm very much... I say almost. I'm very much excited to see it be expanded and for it to have depth, because at the moment it's quite black and white. And by that, I mean there's not a lot of depth or understanding.
Yeah, good old war game view.
Yeah, that's the war game top-down view. That's exactly it. Where you're looking for all the nitty-gritty and all the details, all the shades of grey that lie in between, and then all the colour that you can add once those shades of grey have been established. So, yeah, it's a setting that, for me, is just gagging for expansion, and I can't wait to see more of it.
Yep. All right. I am going to quite literally blitz through all the banner questions very, very fast because we're pretty much out of time. What are the Dragon Children's opinion on the Ulthuan dragons? Really, really fun, actually. The Ulthuan dragons, the Cathayan dragons, just are disgusted by them because they let elves ride them.
Yeah, fuck that.
You let lesser beings ride you? Ugh, gross.
Yeah.
Yeah. They go, why would you allow lesser beings to like ride you? Are you their slaves? And of course the Ulthuan dragons are like, no, they're our partners. And the Cathayan dragons go, gross. So they're equals to you? Y'all are shameful. You're a disgrace to what a dragon is. So yeah,
and it's also worth saying, just as one last fact, let's argue that one last detail, that the dragons that have existed outside of Cathay that we very much know very well are significantly devolved from the original dragons that were kicking around during the time of the old ones and beforehand. Compare the fathers and the mothers of dragons and their enormous sizes with 10 generations later, the far smaller dragons, the far less intelligent, the far less magically capable dragons that we see kicking about. We don't have a big, huge Draugr anymore, sitting over in the High Elf lands just waiting to be woken up. Empress dragon is a piddly thing in comparison. Even though that dragon is still a big dragon. We're not talking about a dragon that could be the size of a mountain range. So I think they don't just see them as lesser because they can be ridden. They see them as lesser because they are lesser.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, no,
like
I saw your dad and you're just a pale comparison.
Yeah, totally.
Why are Zhao Ming, Miao, Ying favored by so each of the dragon children has a different relationship with their parents, and it's family dynamics. Like that's like you could ask the same question about humans. So family dynamics.
That was easy. Next.
What info have we got on the new items? What items do the other two have? So the long story short, Miao Ying has a helmet piece or like a circlet thing that was gifted to her by her father that augments the winds of magic, and then the artificers of Nangao made her a set of van braces that are like those little cool badass glove things she wears. They made those for her. They kind of look like they either made an imitation of her scales or maybe made by her scales, but she then further empowered them with the wind of Yin to give them magical properties. Zhao Ming was given his little horn headdress thing by his mother as a gift that augments heavily the winds of magic for him. And then he forged for himself some items that he carries on his person that further augment his powers. They channel the wind of shaman to literally repair his scales as he's fighting, which is super badass.
It's awesome.
Yeah, and then Yuan Bo has a sword that's forged out of one of his father's fangs, which is nuts. And he's also got his jade armor, which has pieces of jade in it that he can see through as if they were his eyes, giving him 360 view, which I have no idea how that works on his brain. That must be hard. But what's really cool is that his mother and his father can also see through them. So they can always see what their son is up to. Yeah, literally helicopter parenting. Oh boy,
elf on a freaking shelf.
Yeah, and then the other two, I suspect Li Dao is probably going to have like a really big spear or halberd of some sort. I suspect he's going to be very big, heavily influenced by like Romance of the Three Kingdom legendary characters. And you know, one of the most famous weapons from those age are those halberd type fights. So he's probably going to be very based on that. Yin-Yin, I think, is going to have a bow. Because it makes sense for her being a Grand Admiral because she can shoot from her ship. Though I expect her bow is going to be fucking terrifying compared to most bows because a dragon is firing it. Yeah. What ways does Zhao Ming's madness manifest? So some of it is propaganda, some of it is real. The real way his madness manifests is that he literally hears the Great Maw talking to him and he talks back to it. Now, whether
is that madness or is that just a state of affairs?
Yeah. Now, it certainly makes him look crazy because he's talking to someone that no one else can see. And there are implications that he might see things that are not there, or maybe they really are there and he's just the only one that can see them. Because Warhammer is creepy like that. But a lot of the madness is that he cares about humans and he actually associates with his children and his followers. And the other dragons are like, oh, clearly he's lost his mind because otherwise he would not dishonor himself. So Why were Yin-yin and Li Dao assigned to their respective provinces? We don't really know. Presumably, Li Dao is probably a terrifying fighter and relentless in his savagery, so that's probably why he was sent to deal with an endless war in the south. And Yin-yin, I don't know. We don't know enough about her, really, to answer that yet. What was Shinzu's job before she went missing? The only hint we have is in the opening cinematic to the Cathay campaign, which is that she brought light to Grand Cathay. She fended off the darkness, and with her life absence, the darkness goes stronger and therefore throws the world out of harmony. So she apparently acted as a counterbalance to chaos just by existing. Which, you know, Lore of Light kind of makes sense. You good, Andy? What about the elves? What do the lizardmen and the elves think about the lores of yin and yang? They probably think it's a little weird. I don't know. That's a really complicated question that we don't have any.
You know, that's almost a question that's worth spending time on. So not right for right now, because I think that's a really good one. So Fader, if you're still kicking around and you see us doing a stream that this is related to in future, for example, connections between species, different magical traditions, ask again, because I think that is a fascinating question.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yeah, don't have time for that. Sorry. If Shiyama is the spirit dragon sent to somewhere in the Dragon River, what is Shiyama's rest south of the Dragon River? That's probably where she died. Almost assuredly. Shiyama's rest is almost assuredly where she transitioned into whatever she became, or presumably died. Do I agree with the lore of magic that was associated with the Dragon Children, so we've seen so far? Yes, I think the lores of magic for them are fine. It's a little messy because of like their colors, but if you start really exploring how the elemental winds are represented versus the winds of magic as we know them in the West, it makes much more sense. It's still a little weird in a few places, but it's yeah.
I think it's also worth adding that we are dealing with a war game here rather than necessarily a pure reflection of what the characters are capable of doing. It's very likely they can channel all the winds of magic anyway. I mean, if their kids can do it, they can do it. If their kids can do high, they can. So
in order to wield yin and yang, you have to be able to wield all 8 winds.
Exactly. So it's not that they can't do all those other things. They can almost certainly do all those other things. It's just those are the ones that have been picked out to make work best for the war game and to best reflect their characters according to how they've built them. So long story short, they can probably do a lot more.
Limitation of the medium. Question must be asked: how would Emmerich and Miao Ying actually feel about each other if they met? As much as everyone loves the memes and shipping them together, I honestly think they would not get along. They represent 2 very different ideals, and Miao Ying is probably the least tolerant of other species. And Emmerich is like the living embodiment of everything the Cathayan dragons dislike about the High Elves.
Yeah, I think that would be a match not made in the heavens or the celestial realms. Nope.
Yeah, but the artwork is very cute.
It is.
How would dragon children taught other races? Not great. They would always see them as lesser. They're very speciesist. Zhao Ming is literally the only one that's said to be friends with anyone that's not dragons.
Yeah.
I don't even know if the other dragon kids have friends. Probably don't. Is Yuan Bo also the head justice of Cathay as well as regent, executioner, spymaster, poet, and bureaucrat?
Kinda.
Probably.
Yeah. I mean, kinda. I mean, who else is going to be doing that job? If you're looking for who's going to be making the top decision other than the emperor himself. So pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, Yuan Bo is the Andy Law of Grand Cathay. He has all the hats.
Yeah, he is wearing all the hats.
Is Yin-yin interested in trade and commerce first? Yes, that is her job. That's a huge part of her job. So yeah, I would say
absolutely. I think she's also, given the character that we've been given, almost certainly a known entity amongst many of the external and neighboring realms. So she will almost certainly be known by Nippon, by parts of Koresh, down into Ind. Of any of them, she's the one who's most likely to have been contacted with and acting as a bridge in some respects through to Cathay. So she's probably not just trade and commerce, but diplomacy, because there's no other real route into diplomacy other than, I mean, no, even then, no, that's the real route in, because that's where the vast majority of their trade is coming in.
Yeah, I would not be shocked if there is upcoming new lore where it's like a Phoenix King has probably met Yin-yin. It's like, look, it's the Dragon Empress.
I think that's a very likely outcome, because in the end, they're going to want to try and take the Dragon Kids as a whole and introduce them to the wider Warhammer world, because what's the fucking point of having them if you don't? So they're going to need easy routes for them to do it. And Yin-yin, who has yet to be really fleshed out anyway, is a perfect opportunity for that.
Yeah, also a Lore of Beast embodiment being a diplomat sounds hysterical.
It's just brilliant.
Yeah.
And I think speaks to how the Cathayans take things in a different direction, which is one of the reasons why I really like it.
Yeah. Is Zhao Ming at all aware of the old world's mastery of alchemy? Yes, 100%. He's literally the Lord of Shenyang, where all of the caravans come. If anything, he probably deals the most with the old worlders. Like Yin-yin deals a lot with like End and Ulthuan especially, and all those guys. But like, if you're coming from Talea or the Empire, any of those guys, it's for them, it's generally better to take the caravans than to sail, because sailing across the oceans is a bitch. And also, Nagaroth and Lustria are in the way, and there's no isthmus that you can sail through like there is in our world. You know, Teddy Roosevelt didn't dig out the Panama Canal, so you have to go around, which is just awful. So yeah, he deals with humans. Like he deals with the old world more than anybody else, so I'm sure he knows a lot. And he also welcomes like literally illegal wizards, so I'm sure he is all too happy to meet the Empire wizards that travel with the caravans and say, hey, let's talk shop, come on in, let's chat. There's a reason in the Immortal Empires trailer you see Zhao Ming and Balthazar Gelt fighting side by side. That is not an impossible scenario by any means of the imagination. Those two would probably actually get along very well, and it would probably be kind of creepy. They're both a little off.
Even though Gelt's a dick, but sure.
Yeah. Yeah, actually funny. I think Zhao Ming is probably more human than Gelt is, which is really ironic.
Agreed.
Yeah, that needs to be our next stream. I need to know why you hate Gelt so much. I'm so curious. Anyway, what does Zhao Ming do, if anything, to ensure the land trade of the old world isn't upset by the various thirsts of the Darklands? He's friendly with the ogres, and he also remember, the caravans aren't just going one way, they go both ways. They take supplies and trade and money both ways. So he's also sending troops. He's sending agents. Like, he wants people to make it back. Otherwise, there's no point. So I would say he's very heavily involved. What are the odds we see one of the Lost Dragon Shield shows the Chaos Champion? If so, which god do you think they go with? Chaos Champion, no. Corrupted, sure. And it's probably Flame Fang, and Flame Fang is said to be a Zinchian Chaos Dragon.
Yeah.
The Dragon Emperors put a bunch of stuff into the Bastion.
I think the chance of one of them falling is...
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, you go.
We already answered this earlier.
The chance of one of them falling... Yeah, we did. Just move on to the next one.
Okay. Is there a pressure for the Dragon Children to make children? Yeah, probably. I imagine there is an incredible amount of pressure.
I imagine that's going to get dealt with in future expansion, because there is a lot there to unpick, some of which could come out very unfortunate if they're not careful.
Yeah, there is probably a notable role of, there is a duty to have X amount of children, because they play important roles in the military and in the bureaucracy of Grand Cathay. And for some of the dragons, it's probably like, I imagine for some of them, there's different challenges. I think, it's like you might have the likes of Miao Ying, who's disgusted by humans and might be kind of like, ugh, but it's like, it's my job. So I am distant from it, but I perform it to perform my role. Whereas Zhao Ming, I could see having conflicts of, dad wants me to have X amount of kids, but I only want to do this with people I genuinely love and care for. And that's not producing the amount of children that dad thinks I should be producing, but mom says I should follow my heart. Like, there's a lot of really interesting drama that could be there.
Yeah, agreed.
If Cathayan dragons were to somehow meet with the named Stormcast dragons, how would that meeting go? Probably weird. Krondis and Karazai, that would be that's a good question. I don't have enough time to delve into that as much as I would like to.
I think that's one we want to take up another day.
Yeah, it would be weird. Would be the answer. I think they would like them more than most of the other Warhammer dragons, but they also worked with the Lizardmen, so that would probably cause some conflict. How do the Dragon Children view the Lizardmen nowadays after their rocky history? The Cathayan dragons very much see, I think, the Lizardmen in the sense of, I think they see them as lost children. Yeah. I think they see them as they don't know what they're doing, and they are chasing after parents they never understood. So I do think there is a sense of, the Cathayans do not seem to hate the Lizardmen, because they seem to understand that the Lizardmen are as opposed to chaos as they are. but they also do not agree on a lot of things. There's a lot of resentment there, but I also think there's some, not sympathy, I don't know if that's the right word, but there's some like pity. I would say pity.
I think sympathy's not quite right, because I'm not entirely sure sympathy is a strong dragon emotion. I would say it's more likely to be just general contempt.
Yeah, contempt. Contempt would be better. But I would not say they hate the lizardmen. I think they are sometimes annoyed by them, but I think I think they're much like the high elves, where the high elves don't hate the lizardmen, they don't like the lizardmen, but they understand that the lizardmen are not necessarily their enemies. But they probably also understand that they don't really want to be on the lizardmen's bad side if they can avoid it, because the lizardmen can be very problematic, because the Slawn are very dangerous. The Slawn are super fucking dangerous, even for the likes of the Dragon Children.
Yeah, children of the old ones.
And then this will be the last thing from Hammond. Well, actually, no, hold on. I want to address this because this is always a nitpick. No, the lizardmen are not automatons. They seem like automatons from a human perspective. They are nothing like automatons. They are far too bestial. They do feel emotions, but their emotions are very different from ours because they're cold-blooded and they're reptilian. But they do feel things. Like, Tehenuin is said to be a fiery orator who gives insane speeches that moves the lizardmen, even the source of the crossdoors.
Exactly, which means they have to be able to be moved.
Yes. And like the lizardmen feel rage when they're dealing with like demons and stuff. It's just that their emotions are very alien. But they feel emotions. Anyway, do you think there could be a Shugegan legendary lord, son or daughter of Shinzu DLC that the story would be to find mom? How likely? 0 of 10. As much as I would love that, Total War, you have to remember we have a very limited amount of slots. We have a very limited amount of assets and time. And when you have already established that the Dragon Children are legendary lord level, then the other characters kind of have to be around that level of interest or importance. I think you'll see the Monkey King, and then I think you'll see the other 2 Dragon Children, and that's going to be it, honestly. Yeah. Now, as a legendary hero, maybe. But I don't think it'll be about finding Shinzu. The story of Total War Warhammer 3 has already taken Shinzu's story as far as they're allowed to go with it. The fact that Games Workshop even let them use Shinzu shocks me, because it kind of introduces some complications for the old world, because it establishes that Shinzu is around. But I would say very much that no, they are. I don't think you'll ever see a Shugegan named character until like a roleplay game, or we get like an army book that expands on the lore. But like for a roleplay game, you'll see Shugegan fucking everywhere. Because
agreed.
But no. I think for Total War, they're just going to be your nameless generic characters.
Yep.
Though, like I said, if they did give me like a legendary hero who's like the eldest living child of Shinzu, that would be fucking awesome. I'd be down for that. Okay. I've seen this joke a lot of times of, could the Changeling be the same race as the Moon Empress? I don't think so. Like, I think the Changeling... I honestly...
No, because the Changeling's a demon. It's an actual definite demon. Now, you could argue that it's potentially an ascended demon prince, but it's not a demon prince. It's been quite clearly defined as a demon and as a part of Tzeentch's overall pantheon. So the answer would be no, unless they decide to change it.
Last question.
Yeah, good point. I was off this week because Lindsay was ill, so I did almost no streaming this week at all. So next week I'm going to start streaming up again. So you might see me streaming it next week. We'll see. I've got a bunch of side episodes that I'm doing for LAWhammer, because there's a bunch of rather important things that need to occur.
Poor Leopold.
We're busy organizing ourselves some taping for that in the background. But yeah, I intend to do that next week.
Okay. Last 2 questions for real. This is a great question. There's a lot of interesting things that could be explored there. I bet there is some very interesting drama between the different bloodlines.
Yeah.
And
I think that would be at the heart of the politics.
Yeah, and I genuinely think this is going to be explored. I honestly think Moonclaw and Quay Yin would be very antagonistic towards each other, especially if they fix the timeline like I think they should. And Morsalib is what destroyed the race on the moon. That they'd be stupid not to do that, because it's such a good story. And so Quay Yin being the last child of Manslib, and then Moonclaw being the only child of Morsalib, they would go like that would be a hell of a showdown. with some fascinating lore implications. Let the aliens fight. All right. Anyway, thank you all so much for joining us. We are well over time, so we appreciate y'all being here. Tons and tons of people tuned in today, so really appreciate y'all all showing up. We hope y'all are really enjoying Lorebeards. Just for quick last couple things. If you haven't already, bots should have been posting it throughout the stream. Please go subscribe to LAWhammer and Rookery Publications on YouTube and Twitch. They're awesome. Rookery resumes when?
Oh, it's a good question. I should double check that, but I think it's a week Saturday.
So not this Saturday, but next Saturday?
Saturday after.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Rookery Publications is a company that Andy is founded.
Yeah, I founded it with some super awesome people.
Yeah, and they do a lot of general roleplay stuff, but they invite like some of the most amazing authors and game creators and all sorts of stuff, like literally people from all different corners of spheres you are going to be interested in. They also help create and sell books that are good for any RPG system, which is fantastic. So if you play D&D, their stuff will work for you. If you play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition, their stuff will work for you. If you play, I don't know, fucking Cthulhu, their stuff will work for you. Man, I'm running out of roleplay systems. So check those out and buy them, please. And then also LAWhammer, where he's running The Enemy Within, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition. He's running his own version of it. It's not the same you'll find in the printed books, but it's fucking incredible. And it's amazing. I literally have been keeping up with it, and I need to do streams about it because I have so many things I want to posit on without Andy being able to tell me if I'm right or not, and just let our community get it wrong, and then him be like, God, they're going the wrong direction.
But that's half the fun.
This will be so fun. There are so many things he has dropped where I'm like, I love that. I would not do it that way, but I love it. I'm really interested to see where this is going to go. And a lot of special characters have been getting name drops. There's been Malekith has had some moments and some cool stuff. Be'lakor has made some cool moment appearances. Karl Franz is going to play a very critical role.
Funny you should say that.
Yeah, that was a pun that I did not intend.
Well done.
Also, very importantly, two things. If we get to 5,000 subscribers on LAWhammer on YouTube, I will release the Quay cut, the Snyder Quay cut, which has been a heavily requested video for like 3 years. I've actually made some really nice progress on it this week. I started recording a little bit, and then I found some music I want to use in the video, but I have to buy the licensing to it. But anyway, so some progress has been made on that, which is nice. And but I will not release it until Andy Law hits 5,000 subs on YouTube. We're almost halfway there. So
please, go sub!
For the love of God, go sub. Share it with your friends, and go watch the show. It's literally great to watch with friends. I spend a ton of time watching it. It's fantastic. I really cannot talk enough about how good it is. And he also does like a lot of other like side rules and stuff. Like I'm playing I'm playing The Enemy Within, though I'm doing the book version with some of my own edits, but I'm doing The Enemy Within on my secondary channel right now, and it's been a lot of fun. And I've been using some of Andy's house rules because they just make the game run better. And it's nice. You can't subscribe a second time. Yeah, you can make another account. Cheat the system. No, but anyway, don't actually do that. But yeah, dude, that's fine. But don't actually do it, but do it. And last thing is that the vote for next week's Lorebeards will be on Andy's channel.
Yes, as well. So you have to go find me.
Yeah. So subscribe to him. That way it shows up on your community tab, and the vote will be there, and we'll let you guys decide.
And I will end on one other thing as well, and that's that I found this stream particularly fascinating, super fun. Beyond the fact that I'm a bit jittery and juttery now because I'm coming through on an iPad and a mobile phone rather than...
at least the sound quality is actually not bad.
But at least I'm here. But beyond that, I found it super fascinating. But I found it fascinating because this is a subject that I don't know very well. Now, for those of you who have known me from other jobs that I've done, I know Warhammer really very well. I've bought every single book that it's ever released. I've played every game, and I've collected pretty much every single army. But I haven't played Total War 3. And because of that, I've got some enormous gaps in my knowledge for the extra stuff that Andy Hall and the team over there have been adding over the course of time. So we were discussing methods for us to potentially review that, discuss it, and show people who, for example, may know me better from, say, the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay side of things, and what we can take from Total War and bring into our games elsewhere. So we haven't decided exactly what we're doing yet, but we're going to sit down, have a little chin wag between ourselves, and figure out how we can do a good stream that can educate me and hopefully educate everyone else as well about the differences between Warhammer as a whole and Total War and how it brings things to
the Total War verse.
For example, Grom should not be in Total War 3. I mean, what the fuck is that? But
genuinely
Grom
a funny story behind that,
3,
yeah.
And Grom kicks ass. So discussing all those fun little extras and perhaps discussing some of the units that you get that are unique to the game and how they could perhaps be taken over into other games as well will be something we're currently beavering away at in the background. So be aware that is coming soon-ish.
Yeah. And another fun thing to do would actually be one day we'll have to do is there's actually a lot of enemy within references in Total War Warhammer that go over a lot of people's heads. Like, a lot of people do not understand why some of the settlements they picked for the Empire are where they are, which would be really funny to go over with you publicly and let you explain why these places got selected and why they're
That'd
also
be super
important.
fun. I'd love that.
Because there's a hilarious amount of references to the enemy within that just nobody gets. So anyway, thank you all for watching. I will be back in a few hours. I don't know if I'm going to stream Total War 3 or Baldur's Gate. I don't know. One of those two. But because I might play some more Yuan Bo because embargoes. But anyway, that's it. My outro is awful. Yeah, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.